Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom. I'm the creator of rulingplanets.com and Christopher Renstrom Astrology. And this time, I wanted to talk to you about Saturn entering the zodiac sign of Aries on May 24th. Now, whenever Saturn enters a zodiac sign, this has the opposite effect of Jupiter entering a zodiac sign. When Jupiter enters a zodiac sign, everyone gets all kinds of excited and overjoyed. And that's because Jupiter is the planet of good fortune and higher purpose. And Jupiter happens to be in a zodiac sign for a year. So whenever Jupiter is transiting your sign, there's this feeling of like, oh, yay, I'm finally going to get a break, or good fortune is going to smile on me, or I'm going to discover my higher purpose. And I have an entire year in which to do it. Well, when Saturn enters a zodiac sign, the reaction is less than positive. In fact, it's more mournful or dirge-like. And that's because Saturn is associated to tests, trials, and tribulations. Saturn is the exact opposite of Jupiter. Where Jupiter is very upbeat and optimistic, Saturn is slow, sad, and melancholic. The best way to sort of think of these two planets is Tigger and Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. Tigger's always bouncing around and having a lot of fun, and Eeyore's always moaning and complaining and saying things like, "Oh, Pooh, it will never work." And more than that, Saturn happens to be traveling through a zodiac sign for 2 years instead of Jupiter's 1. So, again, with Saturn entering into the zodiac sign of Aries, chances are there are a lot of people born under the sign of Aries or who have Aries rising who are like, really? Can't I get a break somewhere in all of this? Not Saturn coming into Aries. Ugh, when will I ever get a break? And that's a legitimate question. But there's a little bit more to Saturn than being the cranky old man of the zodiac. Yes, Saturn does indeed bring tests, trials, and tribulations. But Saturn also brings perseverance, tenacity, and a wisdom that's based on your own experience, where you actually call upon yourself and your own inner strengths that you never thought that you had during the period of time that Saturn is pushing you or pushing against you, which might be a better way of putting it. Now, why is Saturn the planet of tests, trials, and tribulations? Why does Saturn have such a negative reputation? Many of the descriptions of the planets in astrology come from Greek mythology that was then translated into a more Roman context. So, turning back to Greek mythology, at the creation of the world, you have two deities. That is Uranus and Gaia. Uranus, or Uranos, was Father Sky, and Gaia was Mother Earth. And they were hopelessly in love with one another. And they made love all the time and gave birth to all wonderful things that lived on the planet Earth, whether it was vegetable or whether it was animal. And these were the fruits of their love making. Well, there came a time in which Gaia began to give birth to creatures that Uranus found offensive and that he didn't really like. And so Uranus had a problem with this, and Gaia had a problem with Uranus having a problem with this. And so Uranus was like, well, is there anything that we could do with these creatures that I find so offensive that I really can't stand? And Gaia was like, well, what are you proposing that we do? And he said, is there any way that we could sort of shove them back up inside of you? And Gaia was like, I guess so. Now, that probably sounds like a very fantastic situation to those of us who hear the story. It's like, how do you take a child and put it back up inside of the mother? But these are Greek gods and goddesses, and they can do all sorts of things that we human beings cannot do. Anyway, this is what Uranus did, and it was very painful, as you can imagine, for Gaia. And so Gaia spoke to the children who were put back inside of her, who were basically incarcerated within her womb. And she asked if any of them would save her from her husband. You know, she was basically, would any of you rescue your mother from your horribly tyrannical father who keeps putting undesirable children back up inside of me? It's a very painful experience. And so all the gods and goddesses were like, who were imprisoned inside of Gaia, were like, oh, I don't know. But one stepped forward, one very sort of mournful and sepulchral looking god, and he said, I'll do it. And that was, of course, Saturn. So what Gaia did is that she asked Saturn to take a scythe that she happened to have handy, and a scythe is a sickle, and she asked him to take that scythe and sneak up outside of her and lay in wait for when his father came to make love again and to attack him. And so Saturn agreed to do this. And so he waited until nightfall when Uranus descended once more upon Gaia in all of his starry cosmic brilliance. And Gaia was like, I've been waiting for you, looking over to the side. And Saturn, taking that as his cue, immediately leapt forward, grabbed his father's genitalia, and hacked it off in one fell swoop. And so his father cried out in horror. His mother was like, oh my goodness. And Saturn took his father's family jewels, as we should say, and hurled them into space. They went hurling through space like a frisbee, like a huge frisbee flying over the Grecian plains and landing in the Mediterranean Ocean with a big splash. And what came spurting out, frothing towards the surface of the waves, was the father's seed with a lot of blood. And of course, the person who came out of this mix of father's seed and blood was the goddess Aphrodite. Okay, but that's basically Saturn's story of how he castrated his father and came between his mother and father, and he pushed them away from one another, okay? And he himself became the deity that put himself between Mother Earth and Father Heaven. And how this works out, especially in astrological understanding, is that Father Heaven, Uranus, is eternity, Mother Earth is the mortal coil, and Saturn's name in Greek mythology is Kronos, which means time. So basically, Saturn wrapped Gaia, Mother Earth, around in the coils of time and stood between our mortal lives and the eternal stars which always sparkle above us. And this is how Saturn came to be. Well, no sooner did Saturn do his mother's bidding and proclaim himself ruler of the world, then Gaia said, it's prophesied that one of your children is going to overthrow you just like you overthrew your father. And Saturn was like, come again, what was that? And she said, one of your children's going to overthrow you just like you overthrew your father. So I don't know, watch your back. And he was like, and so this began Saturn's fretting, his anxiety about whether he had done the right thing or not, now that he was in charge, and what would that mean? And of course, he's got to have children, and one of them's going to overthrow him. And he married Rhea, that's his wife. She was a goddess, and he immediately had children. And she was like, oh, here's a beautiful boy, and Saturn was like, yeah, I guess that's a really beautiful boy. And Rhea was like, don't you like him in his swaddling clothes? Doesn't he look lovely? And he's like, could you bring him a little closer so I could take a look? And Rhea's like, sure, take a look. And Saturn did, and he took the first child that he had, and he promptly swallowed it. And down the child went, down the throat into the gullet. And I think that child was either Pluto or Neptune. Those were one of the first two those were the two that were born first. And so with every child, Rhea had to go and show him in front of Saturn, and Saturn would swallow him immediately. And now we know that painting from Goya of Saturn, ripping, the body of the child into all sorts of pieces. I mean, it looks like he's tearing into a piece of fried chicken or something like that. In the telling of the myth, what really actually happens is that the children go tumbling down into Saturn's stomach, where they live in a timeless place. They live in stasis. So not only Saturn the god was the god of time, but Saturn the god was also the god of timelessness. And so this is where the children resided. I think it goes Pluto, Neptune, Ceres, Vesta, and then there's Hera. And I think that's the group, the original group that go tumbling down into Daddy's tummy, where they languish in darkness and they never age. And so there's a last one that's being born, and Rhea decides, okay, she's not going to let this one get swallowed by Saturn. And so she wraps it up in blankets and sends the boy off with some assisting spirits. And she takes a big boulder and she wraps that up in blankets and she gives it to Saturn, and Saturn, whoop, gulps it on down, and so that's it. And she's like, well, I think we're done. And so they were for a number of years. The child that was secreted away was Zeus, or his Roman name is Jupiter, who, as you know, is the opposite of Saturn in astrology. Saturn brings test, trials, and tribulations, and Jupiter brings joviality. He brings joy. He is the bringer of joy. His Roman name is Jove, where we get the word jovial. And so Jupiter grows of age, and he comes and he challenges his father to battle. And Saturn's like, where did you come from? And he's like, I've been in hiding. And I'm going to get you to vomit up my brothers and sisters. And Saturn's like, fat chance. And so they go at it in this tremendous war in heaven that takes place. And Jupiter does indeed vanquish Saturn's armies. And he makes Saturn, throw up, his brothers and sisters. This is Greek mythology. And they come sort of swirling out in bile or saliva or something like that, and wiping themselves off and ready to be Olympians. And so Saturn is overthrown, but there's a bit of a predicament, which is, what are you going to do with Saturn? What are you going to do with the old guy? Okay. Saturn's a god, just like the Olympians, which is what Zeus calls him and his brothers and sisters. They're the Olympians because they reside on Mount Olympus. You can't kill Saturn, and you can't put him to death. So Saturn is put into exile. He's not allowed near Mount Olympus, and he's left to wander the world. And so what we get from this telling of the myth of Saturn, perhaps you could hear in it already many of the qualities that we associate with Saturn. Saturn is the planet of time. Of the original 7 planets, which are the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and then there's Saturn. Saturn is the last of the planets, and he's the slowest light in the heavens and the furthest away. Okay, so when you can find Saturn in the nighttime sky, it's a little faded orb of light that moves very slowly. Okay, and so Saturn was, as you can imagine, associated with old age, people who were past their prime, people who should maybe give up the throne and let a younger generation come along. Okay, so Saturn was associated to that. So Saturn was old age. Saturn was the destroyer in the sense that time is a destroyer, not a destroyer like Aries or Mars being a destroyer by going to battle and vanquishing the opponent and lighting cities on fire and enslaving the populace. Saturn was a destroyer in that time is a destroyer. We all grow older and more infirm as our bodies give out. And so that's how Saturn was a destroyer. Saturn was often pictured as time eating its own children. You're born into this world, and then you grow old and feeble and die, and then you're buried back in the earth. So all these associations with time and with slowness, and also the hard work of living on this planet, of making a living for yourself. This is also associated to the tedium of Saturn. So Jupiter and the gods of Mount Olympus got to retreat to Mount Olympus and live in the golden halls of the palace and feast on things like fruit and aromas coming up from sacrifices and things like this. And they really didn't have to worry about anything. And Saturn wandered the earth itself. And what Saturn did is that he taught humankind, who, when they're originally created, they're created basically to serve the gods. So basically they're slaves. They gain some sort of intelligence and culture and identity, human identity. But Saturn teaches them how to farm. And so Saturn is the patron of agriculture in Roman mythology. So it's to Saturn that we know how to do the things that we do. I mean, Prometheus, as a quick side note, may have brought fire, but it was Saturn that showed mankind what to do with fire. And it's Saturn that showed mankind what to do with seeds and to plant. And so Saturn was very much a deity that was associated with the earth and with making the most of your resources. So on one hand, Saturn could be burdensome, because farming back in ancient societies was very difficult. So nowadays, you're still dependent on whether you're going to have droughts or whether you're going to have good rains or too much rain or something along those lines. And so farming was a very, very difficult occupation, but Saturn was the patron god of farming. He showed us how to make the most of our physical resources and to make a living here in the world. And so this is what Saturn also rules over in astrology. So there's this kind of like old man, this age, this ancient wisdom that's associated to Saturn, where the old man can either be a burden or the old man is seen as being very wise and very fatherly. Okay, Uranus may have engendered, may have brought about life, but Saturn is really the first father of the world, even more than Jupiter is. And so Saturn is that old patriarchal figure who can be dour in ways, but also very helpful in ways. I mean, Jupiter, as I said, is the planet associated with good fortune and higher purpose. But Saturn shows you how to take care of yourself, how to provide shelter, how to make a living, how to put food on the table, how to work hard and produce tangible results. Those are the things that belong to Saturn. So what does it mean when we say that Saturn is entering the zodiac sign of Aries for a 2 or 2.5 year stay? What's that going to do? What kind of effect is that going to have? Okay, so what we want to do is think about the zodiac sign of Aries. The temperaments of the zodiac signs are based on the agricultural year here in the Northern Hemisphere, because astrology, Western astrology, the astrology that we practice here in the West, comes out of the Mideast. Okay, that's its origin point. And the Mideast is in the Northern Hemisphere. And so the temperaments of the signs, their heat and their cold, their nearness and their remoteness is based on the 4 seasons as we experience them here in the Northern Hemisphere. So Aries is the zodiac sign of the spring equinox. It is the zodiac sign that starts the agricultural year. This is why Aries is the first sign in the zodiacal wheel. Aries starts us off with the sun returning in the spring. And the sun is exalted in the zodiac sign of Aries because we're all very happy to see the sun come back again after the dark, cold winter. And here it is in the spring, and life is going to spring to life again. And this is a wonderful and a joyous thing. So that's part of what Aries is associated with. It's connected to beginnings. So Aries is first. It's the first sign. And I want you to focus on that idea of being first. What does that mean? A lot of times Aries will be described as a leader, but a leader isn't necessarily first. First is about being out front, okay? It's really kind of about being unprecedented. Okay, you're the person who's out front, okay, so you're taking the lead as you're moving forward into life, or as you're moving forward into the agricultural year. Okay, so there's first, and then there's out front. Aries isn't protected. It's not behind in rank and file. It doesn't have other people going in front of it. It can't hide behind anyone else. Aries is first and it's out front. Aries is also driven by an urgency. If you garden and you see plants in the spring, they really burst up out of the soil very, very quickly. Okay, they may be sprouts and things like that, but they come up through that soil very quickly. And then it's a race to take as much ground as you possibly can, because not only do you have the little flowers that are coming through and the little plants that are coming through, but you have the weeds that are coming through, and they're like, branching off in all kinds of directions, and they're strangling the flowers if they possibly can. So there really is a battle to survive and a battle to live. This is part of the urgency that's associated to Aries, why Aries needs to be out front. It needs to be first, and it's not going to be behind. It's not going to stop. It's going to power through obstacles and things like that. But the other thing that I want you to also think about when we think about Aries is the idea of unprecedented, all right? Nothing has come before. All right. Well, there is something that's come before. It's the previous year, but Aries is the spring of the new year. And so this new year has to assert itself. It has to take the lead, and it has to say, okay, that was the old year. Forget all about it. Now we're on to the new year. And so with Aries, there's this idea that no one has ever experienced the things that I'm experiencing right now. Okay, I'm the first one to experience them. Aries can be very present in their moments. Okay, this is a fire sign quality in general, but in Aries, because it's the first of the fire signs, this has never happened before. This is the first time it's ever happened, and I'm experiencing it. So there's nothing that's really come before as far as an Aries is concerned. I mean, obviously things have come before. We have history, we have culture, we have a recorded past, all these things. But that sense of being the first and being the beginning, this is something that's very much connected to Aries. Now, you can hear already how Saturn and Aries they're not really on the same page. Saturn is old and slow. Aries is young and fast. Saturn is cold and remote. Aries is urgent and it's heated. So with Saturn and Aries, you're going to have the idea of burden or of slowness or of heaviness impeding on things like your urgency or your start or your beginning. Okay, things may not begin as quickly as you want them to with Saturn in Aries. Okay, things that feel like a burden, your relationship to burden is going to be more Aries because Saturn is in the Zodiac sign. So you're going to fight and struggle with burdens, you'll accept them. Aries is a cardinal sign, but you're not going to let them get the better of you, and you're going to fight and you're going to struggle with them. So these are sort of the things that begin to emerge when we look at Saturn and Aries. But Saturn and Aries also puts me in mind of a story that I learned when I was a kid in Sunday school. And it's a story, that was, because I was raised Catholic, that was always referred to as the Old Testament rather than what it really was, which was the Hebrew Bible. So here I wanted to share with you the story of Abraham and Isaac, and what I felt was really resonant with the idea of Saturn in Aries. It just resonates on so many different ways. One of them being that it was the Roman historian Tacitus who said that the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, was ruled by Saturn. Okay. And the reason that he had reasoned that they were ruled by Saturn is because they celebrated the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week. And Sabbath is when the Jewish people do not work and they honor the rest of God. After God had created the world in 6 days, he rests on the seventh. And so the seventh day was, according to Tacitus, when the Jewish people let their fields be fallow, where they rested. And this was completely bizarre to the historian, because it's like you have to work the field every day, and if you don't work it every day, you risk being slowed down or your crops not being whatever. But they would remove themselves from their toil and from their work. The other thing that made the Jewish people so intriguing and so bizarre to a Roman historian like Tacitus was that they just worshiped one God. Okay. And Tacitus was like, well, there's a whole bunch of gods. Why would you settle for one? But the Jewish people seemed to be very adamant on just worshiping one God who was different from all the other gods. In fact, they weren't even gods. It's just the one God. So there was an apartness or a separateness that Tacitus writes about when he writes about the Jewish people, or a refusal to integrate into the Roman society. Rome occupied a lot of Jewish territory as an empire, but there was always this apartness, not being part of the greater society. And when you remember how Jupiter was the ruler of Olympus, which was this, great era that he starts. Jupiter also rules over government and society. Jupiter insists on becoming a part of society by speaking its language, by honoring its customs, by worshiping one of its many gods and goddesses, And so the Jewish people were famous for being apart from that, from refusing to do that, for honoring only their own customs and this kind of autonomy, and also for their resistance. And so in Tacitus's imagination, this was very Saturnine, the idea of not only stopping work and resting and contemplating, but it was also very Saturnine, this feeling of being exiled, that the Jewish people had this apartness, that they would live in the empire, but they would not become part of the empire, and they actively even resisted it. And so, in conclusion, the seventh day of the week on the Roman calendar was Saturday. And so that was Saturn and the connection to the Sabbath. So it's interesting to see that Saturn has this reputation and this affiliation with the Jewish people. So when we return to someone like Abraham, I want you, in the story of Abraham and Isaac, listen to qualities that are coming out. First of all, who is Abraham? He's the father of Judaism, but he's also the father of Islam, and he's also regarded as being the father or one of the original figures in Christianity. In fact, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are all regarded as Abrahamic. That's Abraham as an adjective. Religions, that they all come from this one person. So Abraham is basically regarded as the first father, the first patriarch. And when you remember that Aries is one of the three zodiac signs of the father, signs in which the father will play a very powerful role in the person's life, either through their presence or their absence, the three zodiac signs of the father are Aries, Leo, and Capricorn. So Abraham, at the beginning of his story, is 75 years old when God calls him to leave the city of Ur and his kinfolk and to journey into a foreign land where God is going to make of Abraham a great nation. Okay, now, Abraham had a life before God called him. Okay, he was living in the city of Ur. He was very prosperous. He was a polytheistic, fearing man, and he was quite comfortable, in his life. And so God calls him to leave his city, to leave his country, his kinfolk, and that upon him, he's going to found a new nation. Abraham, being a smart guy, is kind of like looking at his prospects. It's like, you're going to make of me a great nation. I'm 75 years old. My wife is a little bit younger than me. She's elderly. She's never bore me a child. I've never had a child with her in our entire marriage. And somehow we're going to give rise to a nation of people. I don't know how this is going to happen, but I'm in. Okay, so Abraham agrees. He follows this calling to leave behind everything that he's known and loved with his wife and to go and found new people. And he takes some people with him, obviously. It's not just him and Sarah. And they go to follow God to some undisclosed foreign country to begin new generations of a new nation. So what I wanted to emphasize in this part of the story is that Abraham receives the calling old, okay, that's Saturn, to begin something new, that's Aries, and to go someplace that he's never gone before. He doesn't know what the rules are. He doesn't know what the traditions are. He doesn't really know much about this God who has called him, other than it's only him and no other God. And so he is now transferring from a polytheistic fearing man to a single God fearing man. And he is putting his trust, he is putting his faith into this God, this deity who has called him out of his life at the ripe age of 75. So Abraham and Sarah, and I think they're traveling with his nephew Lot and some other people. They don't really go on adventures. They're looking for where they're going to wind up, and they're kind of actually trying to avoid dangerous situations. They kind of go from predicament to predicament and have to sort of solve this as people are kind of like, who are you and why are you traveling through my land? And all these sorts of things. During this period of time, though, Sarah wants Abraham to have a child. I mean, he's getting on in years and so is she, and she's never been able to conceive a child. So here we have this whole idea of childbirth, of setting up a lineage. All right. And so according to Hurrian law, which is basically Mesopotamian law, which is the different countries, the different lands that Abraham would have been familiar with living in Ur and is now traveling through. According to Hurrian law, it's up to Sarah, the wife, if she's childless, to provide the means for Abraham to have a child. And so she's really bound to do this for him. And so what she does is that she takes her Egyptian slave, whose name is Hagar, and she gives Hagar to Abraham as a lover. Okay. And so Hagar bears him a child, and the child's name is Ishmael. And if you're familiar with the book The Handmaid's Tale or the Netflix series, basically Hagar is a handmaid. She is an attendant. And so she bears Abraham a child. And so this makes Sarah happy in a kind of bitter way, because on one hand, she has fulfilled her wifely duty. She's provided a child to Abraham, not from her own body, but from her slave. But according to Hurrian law, not only is she bound to Abraham to provide a child, but she also has legal rights over the offspring. And so Ishmael is regarded legally as her own child. Okay, and Hagar is rendered back into the background, that sort of handmaid slash slave background that she is. But Hagar bothers Sarah a lot. She kind of feels like Hagar's got attitude, or that she's, looking at her like, I can bear a child and you can't. Again, if you're familiar with the book Handmaid's Tale or the series, you know that this is something that a lot of the women who are infertile, have this suspicion and this jealousy and even open contempt towards these women. But then all of this changes. Abraham and Sarah and the people who left Ur with them and who go on to have their own children and things like that, they're building a populace who is making a lot of neighboring lands uncomfortable, because it's like, who are they and why are they moving through our land? But anyway, as they do this, they have a caravan and they're doing quite well with livestock and things like this. And they live in tents. Well, one day, 3 gentlemen show up at Abraham's camp, and Abraham immediately recognizes one of them as God. Okay, it's not like he looks like God. He can tell that there's a sort of divinity or charisma or something about this fellow and the 2 attending men who are angels. They're not wearing wings or anything like that. They look like regular people, but they have a supernatural charisma about them that he instantly recognizes. And one of them says to him, the one that he knows is God, says to Abraham that Sarah is going to give him a child, that she's going to bear him a child that will indeed be his own child. And so Abraham, hearing the news, is astonished. He's like, I'm in my 90s. I don't know if I can still, I'm going to have a child. And the 3 men are like, yes, you are. And Abraham is like, I'm going to have a child. He's so happy. He's so astonished by this information, by this news. He's so delighted, and it's proof positive that Saturn might be in Aries, but they still got it. Okay. So anyway, he's just astonished by this information, and he throws himself on the ground and he thanks. And there's this wonderful moment in this story in which Sarah, who is near the tent and she hears this conversation, chuckles, laughs derisively. I mean, she's kind of like, yeah, right. I'm going to nurse a baby in my 90s. I don't think so, And so she's caught out. The central gentleman, the one that Abraham feels is God, asks Sarah, did you laugh? And Sarah, realizing that she's been caught, is like, no, my lord, no, I did not laugh. And he's like, really? And she's like, okay, maybe I did. I was surprised. And he's like, then why did you deny it? And this sort of like stays with her, as a moment in which she's kind of been like shamed. But, what's going on here is that there is this information imparted to her that she's going to have a child in the most unlikely of circumstances. When the child is born, when the boy is born, they name the child Isaac. Okay, so what happens here is that Isaac is in when he's born and Ishmael is out. We don't need Ishmael anymore. There's a true son of Abraham. And again, there's this telling moment in which Ishmael is playing with Isaac, and Isaac is laughing and delighted. And Sarah's just like, that kid's got to go. I mean, there's this kind of like hostility, that she has of just like, this is my child. I'm not going to have my child playing with Hagar's child. And so she drives Ishmael and Hagar out away from the tents and to make their own way in the wilderness and in the desert. And Abraham is like, oh, I feel really bad about this, but, and Sarah's like, no, she's got to go. And so they're driven out into the wilderness. But God has made a promise to both sons of Abraham that he will make great nations of them. So in the wilderness, Ishmael, who's, a little older than Isaac, who's like a toddler, he's like maybe 9 or something like that at the time, Ishmael is crying. His mother's crying, and Ishmael is also crying in the wilderness. They don't know how they're going to live. They went from being in life in a tent to exile to being thrown out. And so Ishmael cries out, his mother cries out, and God responds and says, what's wrong? And so Hagar tells him the story or whatever, and God prophesies, that he will have a nation of his own and not to worry. And so Ishmael's name means God hears. Okay, so God heard the plaintive cries of Ishmael and his mother and responded. And Ishmael indeed becomes a great prophet of Islam, and he and his mother settle in Mecca. And Isaac, who is born of Sarah, Isaac means one who laughs or one who rejoices. And this reflects the laughter and disbelief of Abraham and Sarah at hearing the news that they're going to have a son. Abraham, as you recall, laughed out of astonishment and joy, and Sarah laughed out of incredulity and even derision. I mean, she laughs in this moment of like, wow, what do men know of women giving birth and having to nurse children? Yeah, that'll be the day. But Isaac represents all of that, the laughter of joy, astonishment, but also a bit of the non-belief and a little bit of the derision. This comes together in probably one of the most famous passages of the Hebrew Bible, and a very important one, but also a really lovely story. And it's called The Ordeal of Isaac. In this story, we pick up with Isaac and Abraham. Isaac is maybe about, 9 or 12, and Abraham is in his 90s, okay? So one day, Abraham hears God call out, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says, here I am. And God says to Abraham, take your son, take your beloved son, Isaac, the son whom you hold most dear, and I want you to go to the land of Moriah. And Abraham's like, mm-hmm. And God says, and there you shall offer him, Isaac, your son, your only son, the son that you hold most dear. There you shall offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will point out to you. Abraham takes this in, and he nods. So rising next morning, Abraham saddles his donkey, and he takes along with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And before they go, he chops wood for the burnt offering. And after he has chopped wood for the burnt offering, he starts out on his journey to the place that God pointed out to him. And so they journey for a day, they journey for a second day, they journey for a third day. And on the third day, Abraham looks up and he saw the place in the distance. And then Abraham turns to his 2 servants and he says, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. And so the servants, thinking really nothing of it, it's, this isn't anything that's out of the ordinary. They tend to the donkeys and to the belongings and things like that. And so Abraham and Isaac set off for this place that God has pointed out. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, the wood that he had chopped up, and he bundles it and he loads it on Isaac's back. And Abraham carries in his own hands the firestone and the cleaver, two things that would be normal, typical of giving sacrifice. And the two of them set out together towards the place where God had pointed out, and they set out together in silence. Neither of them speaks. Isaac is carrying the bundle of sticks on his back, and Abraham is walking beside him with great determination. But there's also a sort of remoteness and a coldness. And so after a while, Isaac finally breaks the silence and he says, "Father?" And Abraham says, "Yes, my son." And Isaac says, "Look, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answers, "My son, God himself will provide the sheep for the burnt offering." And so they continued walking together again in silence. When they arrived at the place that God had pointed out to Abraham, Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He tied up his son Isaac. He laid his son Isaac on the altar on top of the wood. He put out his hand, picked up the cleaver to slay his son, when suddenly the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven, "Abraham! Abraham!" "I am here," he replied. "Do not raise your hand against the boy," the angel said. "Do not harm him. For now I know you fear God. You have not refused me your son, your only son." Then looking up, angel saw a ram caught by its horns in a bush. Abraham took the struggling ram and offered it as burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham called this place Yahweh Yoreh, which means on Yahweh's mountain there is a vision. The angel of Yahweh called out to Abraham a second time from heaven, "I swear by myself, because you have done this, because you have not refused me your son, your only son, I will shower blessings on you. I will make your descendants as many as the stars of heaven and the grains of sand on the seashore. Your descendants shall gain possession of the gates of their enemies. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, all because you obeyed my command." Abraham went back to his servants, and together they set out for Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. As I mentioned before, Abraham is the father of three religions. One of them is Islam with Ishmael. One of them is the Jewish people, Isaac. But then you can hear in the story of Isaac the story of Christ, the sacrifice of the only beloved son, the miracle birth. You know, Mary isn't 90 when she gives birth to Christ, but she's a virgin, and miraculously she is with child. And of course, the idea of the Lamb of God. In the story of Isaac, it is a ram that is caught in the bush that is sacrificed in place of Isaac. But in the story of Christ's crucifixion, Christ takes on the role of the sacrifice itself by becoming the Lamb of God. And so this is where you can hear the story move into really foundational placements in these three religions. But there's a wonderful Saturn and Aries theme here as well. The first idea that I wanted to share with you is the idea of aloneness. Not loneliness, but aloneness. In the way that Abraham walking with Isaac, the two of them walk in silence. There is an aloneness that both of them have. They are not sharing this experience. Isaac, as an obedient son, is carrying the wood. He's following his father, but his father isn't really telling him what's going on. And so the father is silent, removed, and alone. And the child is alone. The child doesn't feel any kind of support or closeness to his father, but at the same time, he's intent on reaching the place where God has pointed out that they should be, and he's resolved to do that. And then there is the obedience, okay? The idea of obedience here. A command has been given. Aries is ruled by the planet Mars, and Mars was named after the Roman god of war. And so Aries has a sort of soldiering on quality that's woven into the tapestry of its character. Aries is built to obey, okay, to follow. That's why people born under Aries or who have Aries rising are much more comfortable in the following position or even taking the lead than they are in becoming the leader themselves. And so here there is an obedience to this extraordinary command, this command to sacrifice your beloved son, the one that you've waited 90 plus years for, the one who is supposed to carry on your seed to seed future generations of this new nation, of this new kingdom. That makes no sense. Why are you asking this of me after you've told me that I had a responsibility to father a new nation? But we don't hear that come out of Abraham's lips. We don't hear that doubt. We don't hear that protest. We don't hear that resistance. We hear nothing. And what we see is a man who is obeying the command of his God. And then we see the cost, this sacrifice, the cost of this sacrifice. And it's going to cost Abraham his son, and it's going to cost Isaac his life. But Isaac doesn't protest being laid out on the altar. Isaac doesn't protest being bound. Isaac doesn't protest as a cleaver, okay? And that's what this instrument is. It's a cleaver, like a butcher's cleaver. Isaac has been turned into a piece of meat here. And his father, the man who gave him birth, the man who has raised him, is now going to put him to death. And so Isaac understands, agrees to, without saying it verbally, the cost of obedience. And Abraham, we don't know the thoughts of Abraham. And that's what makes this story so extraordinary, is that we aren't given insight into the thoughts of Abraham. He is lifting up the cleaver and he is about to sacrifice his own son when the angel stops him. Now, the power of this story lies in what we are not told. We are not made privy to Abraham's thoughts. We see only and feel only the aloneness and the silence and the obedience. The way that the prose appears, which is very simple, it's very matter of fact, it allows us to put ourselves into this position, to put ourselves into Abraham's shoes, and it becomes a first-person experience. And we're left with questions like, what would you do? And what kind of God would do this? And how do we know if we obey this God and perform the sacrifice that he won't do it again? So when we remember that Abraham is the first person to follow God, Abraham doesn't really know this God at all. There are no myths that have been passed down, no rituals, no traditions. Abraham has no idea really who this God is. In fact, this God isn't really outside of Abraham, but feels very internal and feels very personal to Abraham. But we're reminded that Abraham is the first patriarch, the first leader who is following God. But at the same time, he's not leading with great promises or assurances or anything along those lines. He's leading because he's first. It's like Saturn volunteering to struggle against his father. His brothers and sisters refuse to take up the burden of overthrowing his father, and Saturn takes that up. There's an aloneness in there. Abraham takes up this vision of a future people without traditions, without rituals, without really knowing that much about this God. So in being first, there's an aloneness in being first. there's a remoteness in being first. No one else knows what it's like to be first, to take the lead here. And the sacrifice is so fascinating. The way that it is set up as an ordeal. I mean, that's how it's described. It's described as an ordeal. Now, this is not a wish fulfillment sacrifice, okay? It's not like, Mesha, king of the Moabites, when he sacrificed his eldest son as a burnt offering on top of the city wall in full view of all of the enemy forces in order to repel the attacks of Israel. And he does. It's such a harrowing sight, this sacrifice of the son. So sacrifice can be very angry, very defiant, and very horrifying, And it's not the sacrifice of Jephthah, who vowed to Yahweh that he would sacrifice the first person he saw after his victory over the Ammonites, if Yahweh would give him victory. And he would sacrifice the first person that he saw as a burnt offering, and he does this, never dreaming that the first person that he sees after his military victory over the Ammonites is his own daughter. And he's horrified that he had promised her away so casually, so fervently, so passionately, and, they work out a deal. I mean, because human sacrifice is completely verboten in with the Jewish people, but they work out a deal of mitigating that sentence to a life of celibacy. But these sacrifices are very showy. They're very triumphant. They're very defiant, but this sacrifice that takes place, this obedience that takes place, this is about faith, okay? And it's about the fear and trembling faith that Sharon Kierkegaard wrote about, where you are bound to a God who knows more than you. So there's an obedience, like a son to the father, you know more than me, but there's also a being bound to the God because the God can see further ahead than you can. But one of the questions that rises out of this story, this very dramatic story of father and son, honestly, what arises out of this is a question, which is, why test Abraham, who's already proven his obedience by leaving his home and land and kin to follow God into the unknown? And so what's this test about? I mean, is there going to be another test, a test after that, a whole list of tests? And it's something we often ask ourselves when we are being tested by faith. Didn't I become the best person I could be? Didn't I fulfill to the best of my ability my responsibilities and obligations? Haven't I been a good person? And I've been a good person, very generous person, very loving, wonderful person. So why am I being tested? Why is my faith in the cosmos being tested in such a way whenever we come against a trial or a tribulation, a setback? The faith isn't blind obedience to God. What's going on here in the command that Abraham sacrifice his only son, it goes beyond Abraham's life, and it goes beyond Isaac's life. It goes beyond Abraham's future and fate, and it goes beyond Isaac's future and faith into the future. Okay, it goes beyond them into the future. It goes into the future of the people. Now, it's one thing to leave your land and to set out on an adventure, to set out for the promised land, okay? And this is where Abraham is being very much that pioneering Aries. It's one thing to leave your land and set out on an adventure, but it's quite another to maintain confidence in that promise when all seems lost, okay? When life goes against you, when setbacks are backsliding down into failures, disasters, and loss. So that's not what you have when you're starting off on something new, which is very Aries. Do you have what it takes to maintain confidence in promise, in that promised land, when everything seems lost, when all hands have gone against you? It's nothing short of a tenacious faith that's built on hope and disappointment in the unfolding future with all of its trials and ordeals. the faith that it's all going to work, okay? That I'm going to go up against these things because I am preserving this for a future generation, a faith that it's all going to work out, that these are the trials and the tribulations, but I have to keep rising to the occasion of those trials and tribulations in order for things to work out. It's only that kind of faith, it's only that kind of grit that will persevere. That's the Aries part. And one could even say that's even the Saturn in Aries part, that stubborn perseverance, no matter what. But there's also a Saturnian element in all of this as well, a shadow element, if you will, that the Jungian psychologist Erich Neumann articulated in his book, his wonderful book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, in pursuit of that divine mission, that in pursuit of that divine purpose. When you're taking over the gates of your enemies, as God promises at the end of the story, you want to make sure that you haven't become the very thing that had once oppressed you. Okay? You want to make sure that in your pursuit of this purpose that you don't become that shadow part, that projected evil, and that you don't wind up oppressing others as well. Shadow and doubt sound dark and nefarious because they're aspects of Saturn. But in the hands of Saturn, the planet, they become both illuminating and consciousness-raising. So what happens to you when you're born under the zodiac sign of Aries, or you have Aries rising? Well, the burden is on you. All right. We know that Saturn is a planet that's associated with very heavy obligations and responsibilities, burdens, and even thankless tasks. So when Saturn enters your zodiac sign, that is almost the immediate feeling or experience. Maybe a burden is placed on your shoulders. Maybe there's a responsibility that you didn't want to take on, but you have to take it on. Somehow you have to bend the knee to Saturn. Somehow you have to take this on, even though it is the last thing that you want to do. Saturn is now going to test you. So Saturn, as we know, is the planet of tests, trials, and tribulations. And don't worry, Saturn isn't going to test you by having you sacrifice your most beloved child or object or anything along those lines. But there is going to be a bit of sacrifice involved and a bit of faith involved in the command of Saturn, okay? The command isn't so much you being told what to do, but it's the weight of responsibility. It's the burden, and carrying this. Saturn spends 2 years in a zodiac sign. And when Saturn first enters a sign, what it does is that it exposes those things in your life that aren't working. Okay. Now that sounds good. It's kind of like, oh, I'm going to have exposed in my life all of those things that aren't working. Well, that's good because I should know what's not working. In fact, I even have some ideas of what's not working, and maybe I'll make a short list and share it with Saturn. It doesn't work like that. Saturn sort of, it's like in one of those movies where it's usually an old guy, walks around the car and kicks the tires and tests it out and sees whether it can, stand up or not, And so that's what Saturn's doing. He's kind of walking around your life and kicking the tires and seeing if it's fit. And you're going to find out that a number of things are not fit. You might even end up with all 4 tires collapsing and even a fender. Okay. And what happens here is that there's this discovery that the things that you thought were the most secure in your life are actually the first to unravel or fall apart. And that you were taking security in false securities. And so there is a sort of come to Jesus moment here, where the truth is revealed about your life. So the first year of Saturn's tenure in your sign, Aries or Aries rising, is to clear out the dead wood. It's to get rid of all the false securities, the false hopes, the false beliefs, the false things that you have told yourself that are getting in the way of your growth as a person. We can settle for things. We can tell ourselves things that we've been told for many years. We can listen to our doubts and things like that, and they can inhibit, they can constrain, they can bind us, they can limit our scope. And so Saturn, by getting rid of these false securities, these things that have either outlived their purpose or overstayed their welcome, which can feel hard, if not disastrous, but there's still a sense of like it was meant to be, not in a sort of fated meant to be, but with the unraveling of these things, a sort of recognition of how they were holding you back, of how they were getting in your way, of how they were allowing you to postpone, to delay, to put off the things that maybe should be more of a priority in your life. And so the second year of Saturn's tenure in your sign is building back. Always remember that Saturn is a teacher, not a tyrant. Saturn is a builder, not a destroyer. But in order to teach, sometimes you have to get rid of old thinking, those beliefs or even misconceptions, or that fidelity to a school, that loyalty to a school or way of thought is getting in the way of an open mind that can be educated. And so Saturn has to sort of wipe out what came before in order to teach. It's not going to rule over you. It's teaching you to think for yourself. But you may not be aware of an inner tyrant, of an authority that you've projected onto an institution or onto another person or onto a promise. And that authority has taken on a kind of tyrannical reign in your life. That can't be gotten rid of unless it's dismantled. So think of this 2-year period of Saturn moving your sign really as kind of like scaffolding on a building. I used to live in New York City for 28 years. And if you took down an old building, you couldn't go and like blow it up or anything like that. You had a scaffold went up around the building and you deconstructed that building until it was down to ground level. And then you reconstructed it back up again. And so in the second year is that building back, the setting up of new foundations, the setting up of new platforms that are going to serve you who you are right now. So even though Saturn can feel like a burden on your back, at the same time, when it's done moving through your zodiac sign, you will feel like you are so much more in tune with who you are and truer to the person that you're supposed to be. Actually, I would say truer to the person that you really are. Now, if you're born under Taurus, or you have Taurus rising, you're not feeling a lot of free will these days. In fact, if anything, you feel like everything in your life is predetermined, fixed even. In reality, it's actually the habits, routines, and even other people's expectations that leave you feeling installed, cornered, and even defeated. These might be the things that you really define yourself by. Okay, Taurus likes regularity. Taurus believes in responsibility. Taurus relies on habits so that it's not always reinventing the wheel as it goes about the work that it does in life, which is usually building upon or improving the things that are there. But sometimes when our habits, when our routines, when our rituals even fail us, or they don't really resonate in the way that they once did, they feel more confining. They feel very inhibited. And what's happening right now, because Saturn is in the sign that precedes yours, which is called a semi-sextile in astrology, there's a feeling that you're not connecting to who you really are. And there's a kind of discomfort. There's a sort of restlessness. You ask searching questions, but searching questions give you a big headache. You want to get out of where you are. You can't believe that you've gone through 7 years of Uranus, turning everything inside out and upside down in your life, only to end up back here feeling confined and constrained. And that's because the old thinking, the old habits, the old rituals, the old expectations, they just aren't doing it for you anymore. And even your old methods aren't doing it for you anymore. It's not unlike a yo-yo diet that you keep returning to only to wind up with the same results. It's like, oh, I lost this weight. I feel really great. oh, I need to go back on the yo-yo diet. It's just like you get tired of going through the joy, and then the sense of defeat and resignation as the weight reaccumulates. And, it feels like a long, open-ended exercise in futility. What's going on here is that it looks like you've outgrown the role that you play in your life, and you want to try something else. You want to try something different. But how do you do this without upsetting the apple cart? How do you do this without upsetting the people in your life, whether it's coworkers or loved ones or people who depend on you? And it's a very peculiar predicament that you find yourself in. If you're a Taurus or Taurus rising, like I said, you pretty much define yourself by your responsibilities and obligations. You take pride in fulfilling them. Aries, which is the zodiac sign that Saturn has just entered, is famously independent and true to itself. And this is how I imagine Saturn in Aries is going to manifest in your life. It's going to manifest as a burden for you because it's hard for you to imagine giving up your security for something as open-ended and ill-defined as famously independent and being true to itself. So what's going to happen in true Saturnian ironic fashion is that it's going to become increasingly impossible for you to placate yourself. It's going to become increasingly impossible for you to say things are all right. You're going to feel at the very core of your being that things aren't all right, that you're not being true to yourself. And that's where the courage for change is going to come from. It may not come from, motivation or taking on the next challenge. It likely will come from the old and very wise sentiment of, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. That you're so exhausted by trying to keep up these responsibilities and obligations that you will get to a point in the next 2 years in which you do put them aside and you do step into your own independence and authenticity. Now, if you're born under Gemini or you have Gemini rising, Saturn forms a sextile to your zodiac sign of Gemini. And this is a positive relationship. A sextile is a relationship between two signs which are not the same element, but they are what we call the same gender. In astrology, we have masculine signs and feminine signs. The masculine signs, or what we might call the yang signs, are air and fire, and the feminine signs, what we might call the yin signs, are earth and water. So air and fire get along with one another because each really propels or supports the other in terms of its elemental character and its elemental makeup. So when you have a sextile taking place between two zodiac signs, Saturn is in the zodiac sign of Aries and it forms a sextile to Gemini, which is your sign, there's a conversation that takes place. And it's an upbeat conversation. So what happens here is that Saturn doesn't overburden you. It doesn't block your progress. Saturn doesn't lurk in some back corner of your own unconscious, giving you a hard time or looking at you with, stink eye or something along those lines. Saturn moves into a place where it's in conversation with you. So Saturn, as we know, is the planet of test, trials, and tribulations, and that sort of has a very dour sound to it. But when you think of competition or you think of contest, those are tests, those are trials, those are tribulations. A workout is a tribulation, okay? If you focus on an enterprise, that can be a trial. So Saturn's characteristic becomes less prohibitive and more constructive and more supportive when it appears as a sextile position in your solar horoscope. So this is good news. This means that basically you're going to be getting something out of this experience with Saturn in Aries. And what you're going to be getting out of it is going to be recognizable and it's going to be useful. Now, as a Gemini with your ruling planet in Mercury, you're all into that. It's like, okay, great. I'm going to learn new things that I didn't know before, and I'm going to improve myself as a person. That sounds terrific. Now, how Saturn is going to appear or materialize in your life is as people who are holding you to a higher standard than you currently hold yourself. Okay, that sounds intriguing. And as a Gemini, you're kind of like, that's easy. I mean, like, yeah, we can always raise our standards and I'll just find out about them from these people. And that will help me to grow and improve as a person. In fact, you've been hearing this idea of being held to a higher standard than the standard you hold yourself to from people. You're used to hearing that from people who are older than you. Maybe you heard it from your parents or your relatives or older friends, people who said to you, you can do better, Gemini. You can try harder. You can focus more. And you might have laughed it off and, said, whatever. But the fact of the matter is you realize that you could do that. And so you would apply yourself in that way. But at times when we become an adult, we feel like, we've done that already, that we've applied higher standards to ourselves. And, people who are older are now, kind of cranky and they don't really see the future maybe as clear as we do. So as a Gemini, you might be kind of like, okay, I don't, I'll be respectful to my elders, but they don't really have any new information for me. They don't even know how to operate their smartphone. Okay. So you're used to this from older people and you're used to, when you hear it from older people. What you're not used to is when this comes from people who are younger than you. Saturn, as I recounted in the myth before, it was fine when he was overthrowing Uranus, who was an older figure. It was not fine when he found out that he had taken over the place of being the older figure, the authority, and was now being told that someone younger was going to overthrow him. And so there can be this feeling of being sandwiched between the two generations here. You don't like that it's younger people who are telling you, you can hold yourself to a higher standard, or you should have mastered this already, or you should know about this already. So part of you might be kind of like, well, who are you to tell me that, Marcy, or something along those lines. But another part of you, which I love about the mercurial temperament of Gemini, is that you can say, okay, that's fair. That sounds fair. There probably are things that I can learn. And what are they? Mercury is your ruling planet. It will always side with curiosity, of wanting to know something that's new and different. And so this is a wonderful thing. But what you may be hearing from people who are younger than you is that you have to apply yourself in ways that you haven't applied yourself before. Maybe that old beliefs or old ways of doing things just aren't cutting it. Maybe they've become formulaic to the point of becoming stale and even irrelevant. And so the sextile says that you're open to this conversation, but it will be weird hearing people younger than you talk to you about discipline and focus and having to make certain sacrifices in order to get ahead. But again, as a Gemini, you're okay with that. And as a Gemini, you'll like this idea of showing them, proving to these younger people that you have what it takes to go the distance. And you'll even delight in the fact that there are still finishing lines for you yet to cross. If you're born under Cancer or you have Cancer rising, Saturn in Aries is going to introduce complicated dealings with father figures or people who are in positions of authority. And you're going to be asking yourself during this time, are their demands meaningful or are they arbitrary? So in other words, you're going to have some question. You're going to have some doubt as to whether or not this person knows what they're doing, and even if you should be following them. But as a Cancer, you have a natural respect for authority. You have a natural respect for tradition and for ritual, things that have been passed down through the generations. Also, your ruling planet is the moon, which is a planet that is associated to motherhood. And so because yours is the zodiac sign of the summer solstice, you're used to the idea of parenting, just like Leo is used to the idea of parenting. Leo is the zodiac sign of the good father. So there's this idea of parenting that's built into your sign, so you know what it's like to parent, and you have respect for people in parenting or authority positions. But the Saturn in Aries forms a square to your own zodiac sign. A square is an embattled relationship between two signs that are not of the same element, and they are not of the same gender, but they are of the same modality. Cardinal signs are unstoppable forces. They have their own idea of how they want to do things. And so Aries' idea of how to do something is not going to mesh with the Cancerian approach of how to do something. Put a planet like Saturn in a zodiac sign like Aries, and what you find yourself doing is questioning the authority that lords over you. On one hand, you want to show proper respect and appreciation, but then on the other hand, you're really wondering if this person's going about things the right way, if they're judging things accurately, and in effect, are they perhaps getting in the way of what could be substantial growth and even prosperity? Those are questions and doubts that you might have about the current people in charge. And because it's a square, you're not going to have that immediate signing on to obedience that Aries would naturally have. You're born under the zodiac sign of Cancer. So you're questioning whether these demands are reasonable, where these demands are even coming from, and if this person even knows what they're doing and where they're going. Now, if you find that the demands are meaningful, okay, that means that, they may be demands that go beyond what is usually asked of you. There may be an attitude which is kind of disciplinary. You need to give me better work, or you need to work smarter, not harder. Things that, at a certain time in our lives, we're kind of like, who are you to say that? So you might be sort of reacting in that way. But if your feeling is that this person really does have it, that they really do see the way, and so that their demands are meaningful, there's something to it, then this period of time, these 2 years that Saturn is traveling through Aries, it's going to be a time of hard work. And it's going to be a time of building, but it's also going to be a time of fulfillment. You may not see it in the moment, but you'll see it in hindsight. You'll see it when you look back over your shoulder. You'll see how far you've come and how much you've done. And that is something that you can place your faith and trust in, because you're going to feel like you've really risen to the occasion of yourself. But let's say that these demands are arbitrary. Chances are you're already under some sort of obligation or responsibility or even necessity. Maybe you need the money, you need the work, you need the job. And chances are you can't back out, because this is Saturn. This is Saturn bringing the responsibility. This is Saturn bringing the thankless tasks. And so you may find yourself having to make the best of your situation. You may have to coach the person who's in charge from the sidelines. You may have to do a lot of hand-holding. You may even have to step in for the person and then hand it back to them and let them take all the credit for it. You could find yourself in the next 2 years saddled with a faded glory who still wants to do things their own way. And how you handle these matters, perhaps at first you might feel very exasperated or annoyed or short-tempered. But over this period of time, you may also acquire humor, more patience than you thought you had, and even a sort of leadership style, that's very subtle, that isn't confrontational, but that actually sort of moves the person in the direction that you want that person to go. These are leadership styles that are familiar to Cancer. And so during this period of time, you may really refine these skills and this type of style. And you may actually enjoy working with this person, but at the end of the next 2 years, perhaps being very happy to say goodbye to them on the other side. If you're born under Leo, or you have Leo rising, the sentiment that I want to share with you is actually a line from Company. And the line is simply, "You're not a kid anymore, kiddo." And it's this fun line. It happens, I think, at the point where the lead is singing Being Alive. There's this feeling of emotional triumph of really having discovered who they are, having discovered that they've grown up. This is something that we can expect with Saturn forming a trine to Leo. Saturn is going to be in the zodiac sign of Aries, which is a fire sign. And Leo is also a fire sign. And so there's a trine, there's an understanding, there's a simpatico, a copaceticness that exists between these two zodiac signs. And so here, Saturn in Aries becomes a very supportive figure. It slaps you on the shoulder and says, you're not a kid anymore, kiddo. You're a grown up and you're ready to take things on. And that sounds really, really wonderful. But there's always a little bit more to a sentiment like that whenever Saturn is involved. Leo can be a very precocious sign. It's a sign that's associated a lot with youth, and a sign that's associated to be a very special or a golden child. And even if that wasn't your childhood, you always felt underneath you were special and you were golden. And that one day you would take the bushel off, the bushel that was hiding the light, and you would show it off for everyone to see. But as a Leo, right now in your life, you are transitioning from the precocious to the mature. And this is what Saturn in Aries is all about. Now, you may be of an age in which it's like, well, it's a long time since I've been precocious, Christopher. One can always mature more. As long as you're on this planet, you can always mature more. You can always grow more. But what I'm really getting at here is, when you have that special talent, that gift, that attention, that blessing, the things that Leo really does enjoy, there's a kind of early flowering that takes place, and this is a wonderful thing. You stand out. You're smarter than everyone else. You're more charismatic than everyone else, and this is a delightful thing. But any sort of child, like a child prodigy, let's take a child prodigy who's like a musical genius or something like that. They have to make that transition into adulthood. Think of a child actor, okay? Not all child actors who are famous when they're children make that transition well into adultness. And that's kind of what's going on here. You have a brightness that's still there, and you still have a precociousness that's there, but you have to sustain it in your current place of maturity. And when we talk about maturity with Saturn, we're talking about accountability. We're talking about responsibility. We're talking about holding yourself responsible and accountable for the things that you do and accepting the consequences to your actions and decisions. Now, another thing that can happen when Saturn transits a sign that impacts yours is that the things that used to come easy no longer do. And that's something that you've experienced in recent years. You might have experienced it even about 2 or 3-ish years ago of things that used to flow for you, things that were easy for you, just didn't flow or click in the way that they used to. And you've been kind of searching for that. And Saturn in Aries is bringing that back into your life, an ability to access your talent and your skills and your inventiveness and your creativity after having kind of wandered in the wilderness for the last 2 or 3-ish years. It's bringing that back into your life in a new and exciting way. So you're going to be very happy about that. Remember, Saturn is trining Leo, so it's supporting you in this new and exciting way, but you're also going to have to prove yourself. Prove myself, you might respond as a Leo. What do you mean, prove myself? I am myself. I am proof of myself. I don't have to prove myself to anyone. Well, yeah, you do. And this is what the Saturn and Aries is all about. You do have to prove yourself to people. It might be a new group of people that you have to prove yourself to. It might be a comeback for you where you're coming back from having gone through a big struggle or maybe not even being around. Okay, so times have changed, situations have changed, and you have to prove yourself to people that you really can do what you say you can do, that you really deserve the things that you feel that you deserve. And this is sometimes, like if we go back to the child actor analogy, there's this feeling like that came to me when I was younger, or that was youth-based, or, something, and then they try to come back. That you have to prove yourself in a new place in your life. But I think that a really good example of that sort of child actor to adult is Daniel Radcliffe, the kid who played Harry Potter in the Harry Potter series of movies. I remember an interview with him years ago where he was starting out as Harry Potter, and he had said in this interview, I'm an actor. It's like I come into a scene and I ask myself what the interior life, the personal life of this character is going to be. And it's really exciting. I mean, he was talking about acting not as a child performer performing, it wasn't performative, but he was talking about acting almost like a classical actor or a method actor or even a combination of the two. And I remember being amused. I was like, oh, Daniel, of course you want to be an actor. You're 12 and you've gotten a large role, but there's so much more to acting than just acting, And the thing is, he went the distance. I mean, he really has grown into this very stage-minded, theatrical, icon type of person who really understands the nuts and bolts of acting. And in this regard, he never stopped it. I mean, he kind of graduated from child into the adult, and he was led by that light, that aspiration of acting and that passion and that love of it and wanting to know everything that there was to know about it and taking roles that really advanced him in this way. And this is something that I want to share with you. There doesn't have to be a break between your youth and where you are now. Your life doesn't have to be a before and after picture. What you're going to be feeling here is that you're going to feel that groove returning, but it's a Saturnian groove and not a solar groove. In other words, it's a groove in which you have to show dedication, resolve, honesty with yourself, and discipline. But if you follow that coaching from Saturn, if you follow that guiding from Saturn, you'll also discover that you have the experience under your belt to really go the distance in the way that you want to do. And so returning to something can also feel very much like you're discovering it again for the first time. If you're born under Virgo or you have Virgo rising, Saturn in Aries is going to be quite a predicament for you. One of the things that I find is kind of funny about Virgo, funny in a peculiar way, is that for someone who has no problem finding fault with things, it's ironic, really, if you think about it, what a difficult time you have with saying no. On one hand, we have all the critical thinking of Virgo. You can look at a situation and you can immediately set up all the things that are wrong about it and some of the things that are right. Okay, your fixation or your focus will really be more towards what's wrong about something. And that's not because you're defeatist or pessimistic. What it comes from is, what can I do to improve it? What can I do to fix it? What can I do to solve this problem, to solve this issue? And that's because Virgo, being an earth sign, is also ruled by Mercury, the problem-solving planet. And so what you want to do is solve a problem and show the results for it. Virgo is also the zodiac sign of hard work and service. And so nothing makes you more delighted than being given a task to go and complete, and to complete it to the best of your ability. But with that work and service, if someone needs help with something, you can't refuse them. You have to go and help them. With that work and service also comes a difficult time with saying no. So, as I said, it's ironic, it's peculiar. You can see what's wrong with something in a critical way, and the aim is to even improve it. But at the same time, you can see what's wrong with something, and you also can't say no to it. You have to help out in some way. You have to somehow make things better. And that's because, as I said, your mission basically in life, which is finding fault in things, isn't about inspecting and picking out all the different flies in the ointment. It's in fixing situations. But this fixing of situations can also be a refusal to admit that things cannot be fixed, which is very difficult for a Virgo to do. Even if a part of you is saying, this situation is unsalvageable, there's nothing that could be fixed from it. In fact, it's the result of bad choices and even worse actions that were taken. As a Virgo, you will still commit yourself to trying to fix the situation. And what's going to go on here is that by refusing to accept or to say that a situation is unsalvageable or can't be fixed, that refusal to say it could end up creating a lot of trouble for you. Now, Saturn is a planet of limits, and it's about accepting limitations. And when I was studying astrology, that always struck me as a very pessimistic thing. It's like, we're supposed to accept our limits, cop out. It's about pushing the limits and going further and beyond, that sort of a thing. But accepting limits doesn't mean surrendering or resigning yourself. Accepting limits is, okay, that's as much as I can do for today. Maybe tomorrow I can go further. Now, maybe in a month I can go further. Or accepting that I've hit a wall. I don't know what I'm doing here, so maybe I have to go back to school or study or bring in a helping hand or something along those lines. Accepting limits helps us to read the terrain that we're trying to traverse. It's not saying we're imprisoned by it or even using it as an excuse to not try. I'm limited, and so I'm not going to try. But it is about negotiating the terrain, figuring out how to move from point A to point B. And getting from here to there is always purpose with Mercury. This is something that Mercury is built to do. It's always trying to figure out, how do I get from here to there? Now, as I said, we often equate accepting limits with defeat or giving up. But it actually does come from a healthy understanding of what you can and cannot do. Okay. And that's about appraisal, and that's about choice. If you say you can do something, great. If you say you can't do something, that's where the necessity of a no comes in, of saying, I can't do this. And that's the best I can do for you, and leaving it at that. Now, if you can do something, that's great. You're all in. Nothing delights a Virgo more than solving a problem or finishing up a project, going about a task or a duty, or going about a craft, executing an idea that you had in mind. These are the things that delight Virgos to no end. But if you can't do something, then that means accepting, as I said, a shortcoming. This is going to become very important to you with Saturn moving through the zodiac sign of Aries. Aries is in quincunx to Virgo, okay? And quincunx is like a wrinkle in an astrological chart. A planet that quincunxes you means that it doesn't form a natural Ptolemaic aspect to your sign. Ptolemaic aspects. Ptolemaic is named after Claudius Ptolemy, the Hellenistic astrologer who brought us the Tetrabiblos, okay, which is kind of foundational for Western astrology. Ptolemaic aspects describe relationships. Conjunction, which is we're on the same page. An opposition, we're in opposite camps and polarized. We're not going to agree on anything. A square, which is fighting or embattled, trying to get the upper hand. A trine, which is unconditional support and understanding. And finally, a sextile, which is conversation. Okay, these are the Ptolemaic aspects. When you have a quincunx that's going on here, the planets, and a quincunx takes place between an opposition and a trine. So on one hand, you have an impulse not to have anything to do with that sign. But then on the other hand, you want to figure out how that sign thinks and how to work with that energy. So what's going on here is that by you sort of accepting those situations that you can't solve, those problems that you can't take care of, saying no, saying, I can't do this, I can't be of help to you, even though that will make you feel bad and guilty and maybe even perhaps inadequate, that is the best way to be true to yourself. Saturn in Aries is talking about accepting that you cannot do. Okay, that's part of what that Saturn in Aries is all about. And so that accepting that you cannot do isn't going to sit well with you, but what it's going to do is that it's going to cut down on those lost causes that you sort of set yourself up for or sign on for. And what it also is going to do is redirect the curiosity that you have. If you can't figure out something, or if you don't have the solution at hand, that doesn't mean you throw up your hands and that's it. As a Virgo, you're going to go and try to figure it out and do some reading or research, something along those lines. So that curiosity and that frustration, which can come out of a quincunx energy can be enormously frustrating. It can either lead you to give up, but then the quincunx is also going to say to you, well, let's try it again and let's try to figure out what it is. And that's why quincunxes can actually be very creative. And they really talk about the aggravating and frustrating journey of a creative process. A creative process isn't just like I envision it and do it and it's done. That's not a creative process. That's more like manufacturing. A creative process is like, why am I taking on this song? I wrote all these hits in this one way. Why am I trying to do something different? Because I want to break out of this and do something creative. This is what the Saturn in Aries is goading you and provoking you to do. And so by sort of looking at returning to a problem as more of a creative process, as redirecting your own curiosity, you're going to find that you're actually expanding your expertise rather than inhibiting or confining it. If you're born under Libra, or you have Libra rising, this period of time that Saturn is traveling through Aries is going to go against the grain with you. Now, Saturn traveling through your opposite sign is pretty famous for not being great for partnering or for getting together with another person. This is kind of a general rule, but being born under the zodiac sign of Libra, you're going to really feel it, that your partnerships, they can be romantic partnerships, business partnerships, your relationships, your associations, your acquaintances, they're just not working in the way that they used to. They're just not working in the way you think they should. And so Saturn in Aries is kind of like cutting off the oxygen to a partnership or to a relationship. Remember, oppositions are associated with being in opposite camps. They're associated with being very polarizing. You're not really together with the other person. You're not really on the same page. You're not even really fighting. You might even have not a lot to say to one another. So this is not a great time for partnerships or associations. In fact, Saturn traveling through Aries in regards to you is famous for no partnership at all. And that may also be what you're experiencing. So Saturn can either drive a wedge between you and someone that you feel partnered with. And again, it doesn't have to just be romantic. It could be business or neighborly or a friend. Or Saturn is going to bring you together. But Saturn isn't going to bring you together right now. Saturn may bring you back together eventually. And that might indeed be the story of your next 2 years. And the reason for that is because, as the poet Khalil Gibran said about the idea of marriage, of partnership, he said, let there be spaces in your togetherness. A lot of times when we're together with someone, we have to be with that person. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to be with that person night and day, 24/7 or anything along those lines, but there's a touching base. We're in a relationship together. There's things that we do to concede or to yield the field to the other person, or there are times in which we feel like we have to take responsibility for the choice because our partner isn't going to take it, or we have to move ahead because our partner is going to hold us back in some way. I mean, relationships are all about working out the dynamic between two people, and the two people aren't coming from the same place, and they may have very different objectives in mind. So relationship is a lot about negotiation and compromise. It's a lot about getting to know one another through fights as well as through reunions. It reminds me how the ancients used to say that Libra, we think of the scales, they handle the scales with Libra, but Libra also put certain Italian astrologers in mind of a yoke, like yoking two oxen together with one another and being made to work together. So during this period of time when Saturn is basically sort of shutting off the oxygen or the energy between you and the other person, and there's an apartness. Even if you're living together, there can be an apartness. This may be a period of time in which you're trying to get back what you had had before, or this might be a period of time in which you just sort of let yourself be in that apartness. Apartness, as Gibran says, let there be spaces in your togetherness. Apartness gives you an ability to see and to recognize when something is far away from you rather than conjunct on the same page as you. When it's far away from you, you can see the distance, and then you can judge whether that's a distance worth bridging or not. You can see that you're on parallel tracks, and maybe you just want to be on parallel tracks for a while, and maybe eventually parallel tracks may diverge like two paths in the yellow wood. But this is a time in which there's more about the idea of reflecting and kind of even letting that be. If you do come back together, if you do reunite, it's not going to be now, because right now you need to be by yourself, okay? As I mentioned when I began this broadcast, there's a difference between loneliness and alone. And loneliness is feeling like you want the company of other people, and alone is this sense that you really are relying on yourself here. You're turning to yourself here. When I told the story of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham is the patriarch. He's the first person in line of three major religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. There were no traditions that came before. There were no routines for him to follow. There was no theology. There was no scripture. I mean, imagine being the person that scripture is going to be written about and not knowing that. So that's what I mean by an alone. There's an aloneness to an Aries. Some of it comes from, I have to do it by myself, or take the lead, or I can't rely on anyone. I have to be independent and free. These can all be keywords or associations with Aries, but there's still an aloneness to it, like a pioneer, in the wilderness. You are alone. You're following your own path. And so as a Libra, a zodiac sign that doesn't really like to explicitly acknowledge an aloneness, but sometimes yearns for it, there is an aloneness that this Saturn is going to bring that is going to be interesting for you. You've got 2 years of Saturn opposite your sign. And so you might find yourself really I can't stand this aloneness. I need to be with someone else. And so I'll put up with whatever relationship or whatever guise it comes in. Or there might be within you a sort of, I'm liking this aloneness. I mean, I get my own time. I get my own space. I get my own company with my own thoughts and reflections. I get to enjoy my friends when I want to enjoy them. I don't feel beholden to a partner, and I don't feel like I have to hold this relationship together. I'm kind of feeling like I can be me, even though I might not have the clearest idea of what me is, and maybe that's all right for now. So those things can also happen when Saturn is moving through your opposite sign. It can bring a quiet, aloneness, and a silence with it, which can actually be really quite refreshing and restorative. Now, another way to interpret Saturn moving through your opposite sign, and here I'm going back to partnership and relationship again, is that there can be Saturnian events taking place in your partner's life. Maybe your partner is facing some hard choices, has been burdened with extraordinary responsibilities or obligations, or maybe the people in your partner's life are going through this, And so it's coming to you via the person that you're with. And so there might be a lot of hand-holding or consoling, or giving the counsel of silence, of letting the person you care about work it out, because every time you try to come up with a solution, the person's like, I did that already, and, I need to just talk about myself or something. And so, maybe you have to just sort of be quiet and let that person work it out, But that kind of letting someone work it out, even though they're going through it in maybe a self-absorbed way, that can also be tremendously respectful to that person. And even though the person might not recognize or thank you now, one day they definitely will. They'll say to you something like, I can't believe you stood with me during that period of time. It was so difficult. It must have been so challenging. All I did was talk about myself, my woes and worries, or my mother's or my sisters or brothers. So Saturn can also represent that as well. A last thing that I want to throw out with Saturn moving through your opposite sign is, and it can be romantic, believe it or not, even though many astrology textbooks will be like, not romantic. Saturn is like, ixnay on the romantic A, sort of thing. But I've seen Saturn in an opposite sign bring a paramour or a relationship with someone who's older or younger. And of course, if this person's older or younger, you're going to be looking for differences of 7, 7 years older, 7 years younger, 14 years older, 14 years younger. Anyway, but there can be age differences and things like that. What's going on here is Saturn is letting you find yourself in your apartness, but also being a Libra still in your union. As a Libra, I have a hard time imagining that you're going to turn your back on society and go become a desert hermit somewhere. Libras need to be with people, but they don't always feel themselves in a social situation. Saturn in Aries is going to bring that sense of self, and it will come through an aloneness, an apartness, but instead of feeling bereft or like something's missing, you may actually feel like for the first time in a very long time, you're actually being yourself, even though you don't have the clearest idea of what it is. And there may even be a sort of excitement and wonder at who that self is going to turn out to be. If you're born under Scorpio, or you have Scorpio rising, you're going to feel the toil of Saturn. Let's talk about work. Work used to be something you enjoyed. It used to be something that you really looked forward to and you wanted to take on, and there was a great fulfillment in it. And there was even a pleasure in complaining about it and commiserating with other people who were complaining about work as well. Okay, but work was something that you really enjoyed, that really you went at it very industriously and you found fulfilling. But nowadays, you're not so sure that you enjoy it. And let's not limit it to a job or an occupation. Let's also include something that you worked at. Maybe it was a pastime or a hobby or a personal project or something along those lines. Maybe it was even self-improvement, that before you felt, as I was saying, like you were going somewhere. And nowadays, you're not so sure. Nowadays, you're not so sure that you're getting anything out of it. And you're wondering, why should I continue with this? And with all things being Saturn, you're continuing with this because you signed a contract, you promised someone, there's an obligation, you took on a responsibility, you said yes to a task that started off challenging and that has now become thankless. So what Saturn does is that if you've gone ahead and committed yourself to something, Saturn will be like, you can't leave. It's kind of like, if you reached your hand in the cookie jar, it's almost like the lid of the cookie jar, lowered on your hand and, holds you there, so you have to deal with the situation. Situation has, I think they say nowadays, a stickiness to it. It's going to stick to you, follow you wherever you go. And so here you're involved in a situation in which, you're not clicking in the way that you used to. You may not be clicking with the people that you work with. You may not be clicking with the mission statement. You might not even be clicking with your own talents and skills. Oh, God forbid, you might even feel like you're on automatic pilot or something along those lines. So you're having a hard time with things like feeling passionate about it, feeling committed to it, feeling like you understand it. You might be even having a hard time with upskilling, I think is the phrase for it, or perhaps you've simply plateaued. In any case, what you're going to feel during this time that Saturn is in Aries, and it's there for 2 years, what you're going to feel is that you are defined more by your obligations than you are by your pursuits. Now, this is the thing with Saturn in Aries. As I mentioned earlier, when I talked about the myth of Kronos overthrowing his father Uranus, and where it was prophesied that he would be overthrown by his own children. And so, in order to defy or delay this prophecy, he swallows the children who are his potential usurpers, and they abide in Saturn's stomach. Now, Saturn is the god of time, and the planet is named after the god of time. But Saturn is also the deity that was connected to timeless places. When he swallows his children, they live in his stomach, almost like a return to the womb in some sort of way. They live in a timeless place where they don't age, where they languish, and time has stood still. And so how that translates to our day-to-day lives is plateaus. Saturn, Aries, particularly when it's traveling through this part of your solar horoscope, can talk about things slowing down in your life. Before you felt a great purpose, maybe even a great urgency about doing the things that you needed to do. But right now, there isn't such a haste. There isn't such an urgency. You've plateaued, and you may even feel like you're losing your lead. And being born under a Mars-ruled sign, Scorpio is ruled by Mars, just as Aries is ruled by Mars. This feeling of losing your lead, of losing that intensity, that urgency, that purpose is not going to sit well with you. And so there's going to be a lot of struggle against it. You know, you're going to want to sort of wake yourself up to, or maybe I need to walk out on these things, and maybe I need to give up security and consistency in my life and find myself again by opening up a coffee shop somewhere or a florist store or something like that. These are things that you would be, they might be genuine pursuits or interests of yours. It's not the right time for them, okay, is really what I'm trying to say. Astrology is a lot about timing, doing things in your time. And Saturn can frustrate or delay the time. And when it's forming a quincunx, like it's forming to your zodiac sign, quincunx is a very peculiar aspect in astrology because it's not a Ptolemaic aspect. Ptolemaic comes from Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote the Tetrabiblos, which is foundational text for astrology in Western astrology. And the Ptolemaic aspects are basically relationships between the planets. There's the conjunction, which is two planets on the same page, okay? There's the opposition, which is, polar opposites, I want nothing to do with you, between the planets. There's a square, which is a struggle or a one-upmanship between the planets. There's a trine, which is copacetic, simpatico, unconditional support. I'm there with you. I love you. I'm going to encourage you in everything you do. And then there's a sextile where they're not exactly simpatico, but they're conversational. We can work out our differences and our issues as we move along. These are all relational aspects. With a quincunx, it's what I call the postmodern aspect in astrology. With a quincunx, it's all about non-relationship. It doesn't mean that you don't get along, but it also doesn't mean that you're getting along either. And so what happens, a quincunx happens between a trine and an opposition. It occurs, it's 150 degrees away. It's the sign that's 150 degrees away from you on a circle. So it's midpoint between a trine, which is I'm all for you, and an opposition, which is I want nothing to do with you. And a quincunx becomes a composite of those two impulses, where it wants to support you, but wants nothing to do with you, but that doesn't feel okay with not wanting anything to do with you, so it wants to support you only to discover why it wanted nothing to do with you. So I often will describe quincunxes as a wrinkle energy, okay, that's going at it. And that no matter how much you try to smooth out that wrinkle, it's going to gather back into a wrinkle again. And for you, what's going on here with Saturn, remember the planet slows things down. It's elderly in its approach. It's the slowest, most distant light. Okay, so it's going to slow things down, and your dissatisfaction, you might want to go full on Mars with it. Mars is your ruling planet. And so you want to sort of summon up this urgency or this anger or this, frustration or something along those lines. But the more you try to summon that up, it's almost like a sort of psychic quicksand, the deeper you sink. And the reason is not because you're defeated or not, meant to do what you want to do. The reason, according to the stars, is that it's not the time for it right now. It's not the time. And that's something that doesn't translate easily in our society. In our society, everything is, 24/7, right now, urgent, needed it yesterday, needed it the day before, got to be cutting edge, all these sorts of things. And what happens in our society is that there's this kind of like collective fatigue because we're not living in proper time, we're living in a made up, time. Anyway, this is going to become very pertinent and relevant to you because you'll be aware that you're trying to live in this sped up time, and the time that is your own personal timing isn't allowing you to do that. So what you want to do is use this slow period, because that's what this is going to be. It's going to be a slow period. Even if you're like, I was running up and just about to, now you're going into a slow period. Use this slow period, this plateau period, to see what unfolds on its own. There are several occasions in myths and stories where people go into a kind of, indentured servitude. Who does that? Jacob does that with Laban when he's trying to court his future wife. He goes into an indentured servitude. And Saturn is, as famously declared by the philosopher Walter Benjamin, Saturn is the planet of detours and delays. We can get angry at these detours. We can get angry at these delays. We don't have the freedom. We don't have the drive, and we want it. But maybe this delay, where you feel in servitude to someone else, or you feel in servitude to a responsibility or a thankless task, maybe it's allowing you to grow inwardly as a person. On a day-to-day level, it might be teaching you fortitude and personal self-sacrifice and putting a good face on things and diligence and even discipline. But at the same time, it's getting you to draw upon yourself to find wisdom in a path that isn't the one that you would have selected for yourself. And what's also kind of interesting about this detour, about this delay, is that it's calling out the sense of urgency in which we live our lives. We can live our lives with such a sense of urgency that the urgency itself becomes a postponement. We don't have to think about something that is further down the line or the consequences of a decision or an action because we have our to-do list, we have our next task, we have our next thing that we need to deliver. So I don't have to think about the feet that I step on or the people that I throw out of the way because I'm driven by urgency. So that urgency can be misleading. It can lead us to do things in the moment that have consequences that are going to come back and maybe bite us in the derriere. Or it can lead us to sort of put off greater concerns because we're too involved with a deadline or something along those lines. So when we let ourselves, wander, in a delay or a postponement, when we let ourselves linger, when we let ourselves languish, we can discover things about ourselves and our timing and our life that we wouldn't have discovered, realized, or understood any other way. And so this is something that can be tremendously beneficial. And this can be something that you draw upon in the future. And this is why I would say to you, enjoy this time that Saturn is in Aries while it lasts, because you're certainly going to miss it when it's gone. If you're born under Sagittarius, or you have Sagittarius rising, this period of time that Saturn is moving through the zodiac sign of Aries is going to be one that makes you say, I didn't know I could do that. You will truly be astonished at what you are capable of doing. Now, as a Sagittarius, you're a fire sign. Okay, so you're driven more by your enthusiasms and your motivations. You want to get excited about something. You want to get enthusiastic about something. You want to believe that you can do the things that you can do. And you're going to go with a fiery belief in yourself, an exciting belief in yourself. And that's how you're going to go and approach obstacles and difficulties, tests, trials, and tribulations in your life. And what can often happen with a Sagittarius is that you can sort of be like a horse on a steeplechase, that if it can't see its way clear to clearing a hurdle, will stop dead cold and throw its rider. Okay, so in other words, Sagittarians, on one hand, can be driven by a great enthusiasm and excitement, but when they hit a speed bump, something that they didn't expect or something that's gotten in the way, they can come to full stop, all right? And there goes what was driving them before. So a big thing that Sagittarians struggle with is seeing something through to the end, all right? Now, that's a problem that you share with Aries. Aries can have difficulty seeing something through to the end because it's a starter and not a closer. And that refers to Aries being the first sign of the Zodiac, which is associated to the spring, and something like Capricorn, which is associated with winter, which is a closer. Okay, winter closes the agricultural year, spring begins it. So Aries are always springing forward with something exciting that they want to do. And so they can have difficulty with bringing things in for a landing or completing things. And Capricorn can have a hard time beginning something because it's already sees where it's going to go. And if it's judged that where it's going to go is the ditch or nowhere, that's going to be productive, it won't even try. All right. So that's just to sort of give you the idea here. As a Sagittarius being the sign that comes before Capricorn, being the last of the autumnal signs, you place a lot of value on faith, okay? And faith for you can be of a fervent kind. You get that spirit going like a roaring fire until it takes over. And if you hit an obstacle or a wall or something like that, it can immediately leave. The other problem that Sagittarians can have with seeing something through is that you're born under the planet Jupiter. And a quality that both you and Pisces have in common is the escape route or the exit strategy. Like, how do I get out of here? Okay, so Sagittarians do have a tendency, if they hit something which feels dull or burdensome or they're not making any headway, they start looking for the exit ramp. Like, how do I get out of this? And how do I get out of this fast? What happens when you have a planet like Saturn, which is a planet of test, trials, and tribulations, moving through a zodiac sign like Aries? What happens is that Saturn forms a trine to your sign. Aries is a fire sign, just like Sagittarius is a fire sign. The three fire signs are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius in zodiacal order. And so whenever you have a planet moving through a fire sign, it's going to be very encouraging, very supportive, has your back as far as you are concerned. So how does Saturn moving through Aries have your back? Okay, how does Saturn, a planet associated with test, trials, and tribulations, have your back with confinement, with denying you things? How does that have your back? Well, a big word that's often used with Saturn is discipline, okay? Everyone can do something fantastic once, and everyone can even do something fantastic twice. But after that, if you're dealing with repeat performance, a lot of times what can happen with the Sagittarius is a boredom, like, oh, I have to do that again, or even a feeling of anxiety. Oh, I have to do that again? I don't know if I can get that excitement up again, I mean, I already did like twice. So Sagittarius really believes in new experiences happening all the time. What happens when Saturn is in Aries and it's supporting you in your Sagittarian pursuit is that it's giving you discipline. It's giving you support in terms of you can do this, but it's not you can do this like you can do this, like the encounter you have with yourself in the bathroom mirror first thing in the morning, like you can do this. Okay, it's not that. Saturn, by blocking the escape route or the exit strategy, is saying to you, you have no choice but to do this. And you can do this. So what you're going to find is that whatever you've taken on in terms of a pursuit, something that you really want, you're already connected or committed to it, even if you didn't make the commitment. Okay. And the reason is because whatever you were looking at as an alternative or option, Saturn has quietly closed the door, the window behind you, and said, you can't go with anything else. You have to go with this. And that for anyone who's born under a Jupiter-ruled sign like Sagittarius or Pisces is really frightening, okay? Because it's like, wow, that leaves me alone with this. I don't know if I can do it. And Saturn, by saying you can do it because you have no choice, you have to do it, strangely enough, that builds a lot of resolve. That creates motivation. It's funny because we live in a society that's full of choices and options, and we feel like if we have this choice or that option, we can't go wrong, and so we have freedom, and we don't want to give those things up. Saturn is very much about saying you don't have that choice, you don't have that option, you have what's in front of you. What are you going to do with it? And that makes us resourceful. That makes us creative. That makes us trying to figure out what we can draw upon as a resource or an ability or develop as a skill or technique in order to take this on. So Saturn, in a funny way, during the 2 years that it's going to be in Aries, is going to give you a backbone. Okay, before where you were like, okay, I wanted it, but I don't know, maybe I'm out of here or whatever. Saturn's going to give you a backbone, and Saturn's going to make you say like, I think I can do this. I've got fear and trembling. My knees are knocking together. I've got a lot of anxiety, but I don't really have a choice, because Saturn's narrowed that field. But I think I can do this. And I'm going to try this. I'm going to try to do this. So this is going to be an extraordinary time. Remember that Saturn has your back, okay? When Jupiter has your back, Jupiter's like, I know you can do it. Come on. Jupiter's the cheerleader. Put your all into it. I know you can do it. Yay, yay, yay. Saturn having your back is like, you can do this. I know you can do this. And you have to do this because you don't have a choice. It's all on you right now. That could become a source of support. And that can become a source of encouragement. And Saturn in Aries, that's what I would say, that Saturn in Aries is going to allow you to say during this 2-year period, and definitely on the other side of this 2-year period, wow, I can do that. Like, I didn't think I could, but wow, I really can. And because when push comes to shove, yes, you can. If you're born under Capricorn, or you have Capricorn rising, this period of time that Saturn is moving through Aries is going to be a fascinating one for you. Will it be challenging? Yes, it's a square. Squares are relationships, combative relationships between signs that don't share the same element and signs that don't share the same gender. We've got masculine and feminine signs. So they don't have that in common, but what they do share is mode, what we would call the modus operandi, the way that you approach a situation, your cardinal sign. And Aries is a cardinal sign. The cardinal signs are always associated to equinoxes or solstices. They're connected to the change of season and the start of a season, really. That's probably the better way of putting it. Aries is a sign that's associated to a spring equinox, and Capricorn. Capricorn is a zodiac sign that's associated to the winter solstice. So when you're a cardinal sign, you are an unstoppable force. You have a way of doing something, and you are not going to be deterred in the way that you do something. You're going to go at it. But each of the 4 cardinal signs go about things very differently. Aries will take things on head forward. They will lock horns just like rams do when they're fighting with one another. So everything is headstrong and head on with an Aries. Cancer's approach to something is circuitous. Like the crab, it will go around something and either avoid it altogether to get to where it wanted to go, or it will circle around something until it gets closer and closer, and then it reaches out its claw and grabs it. Okay, that can also be the way that a Cancer approaches or realizes its objective. A Libra will invite someone to work with them, and by working together, they can go about a directive, but they don't do it by themselves. They don't do it by locking horns. A Libra will accomplish its ends through invitation, welcoming, and partnering. And a Capricorn climbs, okay? And as I said, it climbs over people to get to the top. That's the way Capricorn is portrayed in some of its more unflattering portraits. But what it talks about really is that you are very directive oriented. You will take the hard way. You will climb up a sheer mountain cliff to get to where you want to go, and it may take a long time, but if that's what it takes, that's what you do. Aries isn't going to take a hard way that's going to take a long time. It's going to power through whatever obstacle it's facing or whatever is standing in its way. It's going to take on and it's going to wrestle. What's fascinating about this square, Saturn in Aries is squaring Capricorn. And so there is embattled situation is what the square is talking about. What's fascinating, though, here is that it's your ruling planet Saturn that's traveling through the zodiac sign of Aries. A ruling planet, or at least the way that I work with a ruling planet is your patron saint, your den mother, your corporate sponsor, and your life coach all wrapped up into one. Okay, it's the planet that looks after you the most. Okay, and as I said, a ruling planet is the planet that rules over your birth sign. So if you're a Leo, your ruling planet is the sun, or if you're a Taurus, your ruling planet is Venus. This is where you want to look to in the sky to see if your ruling planet's going through a good patch or a rough patch of sky. Now remember that the ruling planet is always looking out after your interests. So if Saturn is moving through the zodiac sign of Aries, that means that there's something for you to gain as a result of this squaring off with Aries, okay? There's something for you to gain. It could be wisdom, a lesson, a benefit, okay? Because the ruling planet is going through a patch of sky which is embattled. It's difficult. It's one where you're not going to feel particularly comfortable. But nevertheless, it's one in which you are under that ruling planet's patronage, and you're even under its protection. So this isn't going to affect you the way that a Saturn square might affect people born under different zodiac signs. For you, you're going to see that this is a place where you need to go. And you're also going to respond to this Saturn square as the unfolding of the next stage of your own personal evolution or your own personal growth, or let's just call it maturation. So what's going on here? Saturn is going through Aries, which is a young sign. It's more than a young sign. It's a beginning sign. There's an aloneness to Aries, as I referred to earlier when I was talking about the story of Abraham and Isaac. There's an aloneness to being the person who starts out, on this journey. You're not traveling a well-traveled road. You're not going somewhere where other people have gone. And you're out front, so people are following in your footsteps. They may not be following your lead or your orders, but they're following in your footsteps. So there's something also very precedent setting about what's going on here. Capricorn is famous for not having childhoods. Okay, now that doesn't mean that you had a Dickensian childhood, that you were left in a foundling home or something like that. You never knew your mother, and you went, and when you asked for more, and you were faced by Mr. Bumble, this huge gargantuan man. He's like, "What did you say, Oliver? Please, sir, can I have some more?" More? No, that wasn't your childhood, although emotionally that might resonate with you. But Capricorns usually have childhoods where they had to grow up quick. Okay. Both Saturn signs have that experience. It's not just exclusive to Capricorn. Aquarius also has that experience of being the adult in the room of your own childhood. So you might have had to grow up really quick because you were parented by eternal children who never grew up, or your circumstances were harsh or difficult, or you had to take on certain responsibilities and obligations. Maybe you had to help out around the home, or you were the oldest in line, or something along those lines. And so Capricorns can feel like you had to become an adult by maybe age, 7 or 9, and that you had taken on these tremendous responsibilities onto your shoulders, and that you were expected to be an adult. You were expected to be responsible. Where other kids could be silly and play around, you were very serious. So you might have had external obligations and responsibilities put on your shoulder, or you might have simply felt more mature, older than the other kids around you, that your inner self was really an old man or woman, or something along those lines. That's what happens to people born under Saturn. And so with this feeling of having to grow up early and being the designated adult in the room at an early age, you're no stranger to thankless tasks. You're no stranger to obligations. You're no stranger to accountability or taking on responsibility. You're used to doing it. You've been doing it since you were 7 or 9 or 12, you know. But what can happen in a Capricorn's life with Saturn squaring you, with your ruling planet squaring you, what can happen is that you are revisiting what an adult means or what an adult is. In other words, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say here is this. If at the age of 7, 9, or 12, you were the designated adult in the room and you took on those responsibilities and you succeeded at them, you're still not an adult. You're a kid who's taking on adult responsibilities in a kid's perception of what those responsibilities should be. Now, you could have been precocious, you could have had a natural sophistication and maturity to you, but you're still a 7-year-old, a 9-year-old, or a 12-year-old who's struggling with these big things. So what happens when you become an adult, and when you tick off those decade changes like 30 and now you're 40, now you're 50, now you're 60, now you're 70, etc. Capricorns can be long-lived. What happens is that there's almost a kind of adjustment, almost like a psychic spinal adjustment that's being made here. And what may be going on with you is a couple of different things. First of all, it may be this feeling that, that child's view of an adult has become confining, that it doesn't fit comfortably with you anymore. It's kind of like trying to fit back into clothes that you wore when you were in the 5th grade. I mean, if they're still around, you might take out that shirt and start openly laughing. Like, oh my God, I wore that in the 5th grade. You can remember it. I mean, it's familiar, might even have sentimental value, but there's no way that you're going to, like, I think I'll try on my jersey from the 5th grade. Like, that's not going to happen. You're going to rip and tear or whatever. You're not that anymore. You're still the same person and you have the memory, you perhaps even have, as I said, the nostalgia, but you're not that anymore. And that's kind of what's going to be going on with Saturn going through the zodiac sign of Aries, a realization that I'm not that anymore, but that isn't the young child. That is the adult that the young child made up that you had to be, and that your present adultness is ready to take that off and to replace it with who you are right now. It's ready to say, okay, I can't fit into my 5th grade jersey, but I can fit into this jersey that I can wear right now. Fine. So that's what's going on here psychically for you during this period of time, that you're almost putting to rest anxieties that came with those responsibilities, hurt feelings that maybe you had to swallow because of what was going on. You may be revisiting triggers, things that take us instantly back in time to when we first felt that horrible rejection or pain or wound. You might sort of be like disconnecting the trigger from the time warp and saying, okay, rejection has been something that's always hurt me, but I can deal with that differently right now because I'm more mature. Saturn is always about that maturation. Yes, Saturn was always associated to old age and being slow and things like that in mythology, but Saturn's great gift was teaching people how to survive and thrive in this world. And you had to do it by, accepting where you are and working with the resources that are being made available in your life. And really, ultimately, if you think of Saturn being the planet of time, in a square, you really sort of see it. It's about living in your own time, all right? Because the time that you're putting to rest is the time before. It was a child's version of the future. And now you've grown into yourself, and now you can live in your own time. And this can be a very profound experience for where you are right now. Now, you may struggle during this period of time with authority figures or maybe even father figures. Saturn is in Aries, which is one of the zodiac signs of the father. And you may find yourself feeling like this person isn't respecting my authority or not recognizing what I've done with my life or how far I've come. But maybe what Saturn, in its capacity as your ruling planet, is teaching you is that the recognition needs to come from yourself. The appreciation needs to come from yourself. And that when you embody that, then the attitudes of the people around you change. When we're dealing with a parent who might not have given us that when we were younger, or who can't give it to us now because maybe they're not around, we give away something that we shouldn't give away. We should be the holders of that recognition because maybe the parent could never have given it to us anyway, or maybe the parent isn't in a place where they can, or maybe the parent is benefiting by withholding approval or recognition. We don't know. When you house that for yourself, it's kind of like in the Abraham and Isaac story, carrying the fire stone. When you carry that within yourself, and when you commit to the life that you're living, you'll find the universe getting behind you on that, even if it diverged or went away, or even if it's something that you find very challenging or very difficult. You'll find the universe getting behind you on that because you're living in your own time. You're showing a faith and a trust in the universe through growing into who you were always meant to be. And this is one of the great gifts that your ruling planet can give you. Now, it would be nice if it were giving it to you conversationally, like through a sextile or through support. It's doing it through a square because when we outgrow something, two versions of ourselves are fighting for the upper hand, and we're naturally going to go with the version of who we are right now. And leaving behind the previous version isn't that easy. But what's nice about it is that when we tend to it, when we dismantle that structure that served us in our lives, and when we do it tenderly, and when we do it carefully, and when we do it mindfully, it really turns out to be a wonderful baptism and a wonderful way of us parenting ourselves into who we are right now. When you're born under Aquarius, or you have Aquarius rising, you may find this period of time that Saturn is moving through Aries to actually be really quite constructive, to be quite helpful. And that's because Saturn, when it's in a zodiac sign like Aries, is going to be forming a sextile to your own sign, which is Aquarius. A sextile is a relationship that exists between two zodiac signs that are not of the same element, but they are of the same gender, or at least gender was the word that we used to use in astrology to describe masculine and feminine signs. The masculine signs are air and fire, and the feminine signs are earth and water. You can also sort of see them as yang and yin types of energy. So when you have Saturn in Aries, Saturn is said to inhibit whatever zodiac sign it's moving through. And so what a lot of astrology books will talk about is the inhibiting influence of Saturn in Aries. But inhibitions for you actually work in a positive way because of its sextile. Let me explain. A sextile between signs involves relationships in which signs don't have the same perspective. They don't have the same point of view about something, but they're not battling over it, or they're not refusing to talk about it. They're actually engaged by the differences. They're intrigued by the possibilities. And so they begin to have a conversation about it. That's the way you would do something? I think I would do it a little bit differently than what you're proposing. Really? How exactly would you do it differently? Well, I would do X, Y, and Z. That's interesting. I'm into the X, I'm into the Y, but I don't know about the Z. So what's happening is that it's not a call and response that's going on between the two signs. It's a conversation. They have their differences, they have different approaches, and they're going to discuss them not to solve a problem, but to actually find more ability, to actually widen their scope, to broaden their horizons. And that's exactly what Saturn in Aries is going to do for you. Also, Saturn is your ruling planet. And the way that I work with ruling planets, they are the planet that rule over your sun sign. You have two, Saturn and Uranus, but today I'm going to focus on Saturn. And so a ruling planet to me, when I interpret it, is like your patron saint, your life coach, your den mother, and your corporate sponsor all wrapped up into one. Your ruling planet is actually looking out for you as it moves through the sky, in the zodiac sky as we envision it. Here, with your Saturn in Aries, this is going to put you in touch with like-minded people, okay? People who think like you do, but it's not a Xerox copy of the way that you think. It's something that's, as I said, conversational. They have their differences and they might have their issues, but this could involve engaging debate and some really creative problem solving and some really directed enterprises on your behalf. Now, Aquarius always feels like an outsider in a group of people, just naturally. And that's one of the great ironies of Aquarius. Aquarius is an air sign. The air signs are Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, and each of the air signs describes relationship. Gemini describes sibling relationships, the first relationships that we have in life with a sibling or maybe a playmate. Libra describes relationships of partnership, where we're leaving our home and partnering with someone who is outside the home or outside kin, the things that are familiar to us. And we form a partnership, and that partnership is often defined by a contract or an agreement. And then Aquarius is the person in the group. It's often described as a collective sign, but I find that to be a little bit too anonymous for Aquarius. Aquarius is within the society and thinks a lot about society. It thinks a lot about people, other people, how they get along with one another, and in some ways how other people can help or hinder you in life, and how a society itself has an identity. You know, it's not just a faceless mass of people. But Aquarius, because of its Saturn rulership, and Saturn was always associated to being outside or on the margins, like it didn't belong, Aquarius will always feel like it still doesn't belong in the society that it champions or advocates. In other words, if you were to start a book club, and read your favorite novels with your best friends, within 3 weeks, you'll feel like an outsider in that book club, even if it's your favorite novels and even if it's your best friends. There's something built into the Aquarian psyche that just doesn't feel like it belongs. You can walk with people, you can travel with people, but there's always going to be a kind of out of sync or an apart quality that dogs your steps. And it could dog your steps in a negative way, like it's always reminding you that you're different from everyone else. Or it can actually lead to you feeling that, you're different from other people, and that might not be such a bad thing. And that you will resist anything that is insisting on conformity or cookie cut out uniformity or anything along those lines. And that's where we get into the sort of consciousness raising and even resistance qualities of the Aquarian. Now, when Saturn is traveling through Aries, what it does is that it puts you, as I said, in contact or in touch with like-minded people. When you see yourself as an underdog, there can be an aloneness in that. I'm the underdog, I'm the person who is being oppressed, and I'm going to resist those who are being oppressive, or I'm going to stand up for those people who can't stand up for themselves. This is something that's naturally Aquarian, but it's also a sentiment that's naturally Aries as well, because it speaks to the heroism of Aries. And so with Saturn forming a sextile, meaning conversation with like-minded people who know what it's like to be an outsider or an underdog, you're going to feel like there's a camaraderie that's taking place during this period of time when Saturn is moving through Aries, which is the next 2 years. And I think that's going to be good, because it's not going to be book club where, you're on this one novel and you feel like you don't belong to something that you began. Camaraderie means that you can go your own way and you can come back again, and you can go your own way and you can come back again, and so there's a lot of freedom in that and a lot of joy in reuniting. So I think that what you're going to find with this kind of free range camaraderie, I don't know how else to put it, is that you have the company and you have the information resource of people who get where you're coming from and who believe in things that are similar to you, but not necessarily the same things or that it should be done the same way. There's that camaraderie. This is something that you're going to find very supportive and very constructive for you in your life. You may also find yourself kind of holding a kind of elder position here, regardless of your age. You could be 8 years old and on a Foursquare court or something like that. And, people may naturally defer to you, or you in your life, people may naturally defer to you as being wiser or more experienced. So instead of being that voice in the wilderness, calling out, to people who don't listen to you, which might have been what you felt in the past number of years, you're now going to feel in sync with the people that are around you that are in your life and not in your life. I mean, that's really important. So this isn't people that you see all the time, but these are people in which your paths cross for a while and you travel together, and then the paths diverge and you may come back together again or not, or you may reunite with someone they know or something along those lines. So I see you really enjoying this. I guess the current word for it is network, but network doesn't feel right to me. This is more free floating, and this is more naturally expansive, and this is more you being called upon as an authority or you calling upon someone else who is an authority. So you're becoming a member, or you're really becoming looked up to authority in a community. Maybe it's what you do, or maybe it's community or neighborhood or something along those lines, in which you are relied upon, but you can also rely on someone else. And this is going to give you a general sense of belonging. This is going to give you an atmospheric sense of belonging, because Aquarians can get a little resistant to the idea of belonging. Okay. They always feel, like they've got one foot outside the situation. But here, if we kind of create a loose-ended camaraderie, an atmospheric belonging, I think this is something that's going to sit really quite well, quite comfortably with you. And so you may feel like your interests are aligned with other people, and that together you can build things and make things and construct things and make situations better situations. You can certainly do more together than you could do apart. But at the same time, nothing is pigeonholing you. Nothing is confining you. And so your own anxieties about being pigeonholed or confined will be put to rest. So I see Saturn moving through Aries as not only broadening your horizons and broadening your influence, but it may also be enlarging the scope of what it is that you can do. Currently, you may see yourself capable of just doing this right now. But by the time that Saturn has finished its tenure in Aries, which is 2 years, you're going to find yourself being capable of doing so much more and with a variety of means. And this is something that I see as going to be something that will be tremendously personally fulfilling for you. If you're born under Pisces, or you have Pisces rising, the big thing that you're going to be dealing with Saturn moving through the zodiac sign of Aries, are issues having to deal with money and finances. Now, money has always been a deep source of anxiety with you. And with Saturn moving through your solar house of finances, it's time to face that fear. Now, what does facing that fear mean? Let me unpack it a little bit for you here. Saturn is the planet of fear. That's pretty much what it rules. It rules a number of things like time and like structure and discipline, and certainly test, trials, and tribulations. But with tests, trials, and tribulations comes fear and anxiety. And Saturn rules over those things in our lives. So when Saturn enters a zodiac sign, it brings up what's frightening about that sign, or what's frightening about that house that sign happens to rule over. When we're dealing with forecasts like we're dealing with today, I work with a solar horoscope. And so I will always work with your own sign rising, and then the signs follow in succession from that. So Saturn is traveling through your solar house of finances. And as I said, Pisces often have a great deal of anxiety about that. Oftentimes because there's a feeling that money just slips through your fingers like water slipping through your fingers. Or money is something that you don't manage well in a more Virgoan or Taurian way, and you're at a loss with it. It mystifies you, and you've grown to hate it over the years. With people always saying, "What's your business plan?" or "Why don't you budget yourself?" or something like that. Money just seems like it's a burden, or it's an inhibition, or you just really don't like it. You like to spend it, but you really don't like it. And that might be associated with, as I said, a fear and anxiety, or maybe even a trigger for you these days. And so when Saturn moves through a zodiac sign that has that kind of relevance to you, it signals, Saturn is the planet of time, that it's time to face your fear. Saturn is the planet of fear. It's time to face your fears about finances. Now, does this mean locking yourself in a room with all of your fears? Like, I'm going to lock myself in a room with all of my fears, and they're all like, staring at you and screaming at you like some sort of psychic insane asylum. No, it doesn't mean that you're, locking yourself in with all your fears and that you have to face them down or scream and cry out, or anything along those lines. It means facing your fear. Nowadays, we're often told that facing your fear is mastering it, that we need to be rugged and muscular and determined to face our fear, that we need to laugh in the face of fear. Nothing scares me. I'm laughing at you. Fear. Okay, so we're told to do that, or to master it through this very vigorous way. And that's not how fear works. And it's certainly not how Saturn works. Okay, Saturn, the more you try to master Saturn, it will just sort of like stand there looking at you at a distance, arms crossed, like, really? That's supposed to, what are you trying to master here? So that's not the way to deal with Saturn. Saturn, the planet of fear, doesn't mean that when it transits, it brings paralyzing fear into our lives. Saturn says it's time to deal with fear. Let's say you have a fear of rejection. Okay, that's pretty common. You're afraid that you're going to be rejected, or you're afraid you're going to be hurt. And let's say someone rejected and hurt you in your life. And let's say you never got over it. Let's say it's left you with a fear of trying to connect to someone, or a fear of authority figures. Saturn rules authority figures. So let's say there's a fear of authority figures, and that when you have to face an authority figure, like in a job interview, or because you did something wrong, or you're being corrected in some way, or something along those lines, it gets really scary, and you maybe even have an inner panic about it. You don't want to confront. You don't even want to show up, and you put it off as much as you can. And maybe you build inside of yourself this scenario. And let's say you meet with an authority figure and it completely justifies your whole fear response that went on before. You're like, oh my God, that person was so cold. That person was so hard on me. I feel so inadequate. And, they just really reinforced all the fears and anxieties that I have about myself and authority figures. And let's say that happens a second time, or a fourth time, or a fifth time. And you even come up with strategies of how to avoid it. Like, I just don't want to have this conversation. I'm just not going to show up. I'm going to leave this job or forsake this bond or relationship or association because I just can't deal with it anymore. But with the way that it repeats, that fear of rejection just keeps coming up again and again, what can happen over a period of time is that it exhausts your fear response. All right. When you're on your 125th rejection, you can actually even have a sense of humor about it. It's like, you've been so traumatized and revisiting those feelings for so long, and it's happened again and again, that you become used to it, that the fear goes from something that, was taller and bigger than you. And through tedium of repetition, it's been reduced to something that's smaller than you, to something that's almost like an inconvenience. And that's when you can see how much your resistance or your pain or your fear response has kept that fear locked in, and maybe even given it mythic proportions. Whereas if you have to face this again and again, it loses its mythic proportion. It's not larger than you. There's a kind of acceptance that takes place. Sometimes that acceptance is resignation. This is out of my hands and I can't do anything. And sometimes that acceptance is like, again, you showed up at the doorstep again. I have to deal with you again, And so that's where a fear becomes manageable in your life. And that's what may be happening with your relationship to finances during this period of time. There might have been things that you told yourself you should do if you're going to hold on to money and you didn't, and that's horrible, and you blame yourself or get down on yourself. And you might have told yourself that you're not even going to deal with it, that you're just, that you're scared of it and you're putting it out of your mind. Well, you've gone through all of that in such repetition that it's become diminished, and that during this period of time that Saturn is moving through Aries, you may feel some sort of financial stress or some sort of financial strain, but instead of it sending you in search of the nearest foxhole for shelter, you might find yourself like, okay, let's deal with this finally, and that might put you in mind to learn a different way to deal with finances. That may put you in mind of somehow paying down debts, instead of having to do it all at once and feeling, defeated by it, but doing it in increments. That may put you in mind of how do you negotiate this? When you begin to understand that, for instance, money isn't larger than life. Our civilization made up money, okay? It's just made up. It's not a natural force. When you begin to see it like that and that it can be managed and that you sort of get off your own case, and what allows you to get off your own case is really the tedium of having been through this financial problem again and again and again. I think what you're going to find yourself, maybe you don't master the fear, but I think you're going to find yourself mastering the money. Okay, maybe that's really where I'm going with all of this. And that this has taught you to not despise something that you can make use of, and to rule something that has been ruling you, that the fear has been subjugating you. And that when you work with the fear, you can find that on the other side of the fear is something very typical, something very tedious. It's kind of like, I don't know, a Scooby-Doo moment where, they pull the ghost mask off or the Frankenstein mask off and find that it's just a real person, that was masquerading. And so maybe what Saturn in Aries is going to show you is that there's been a masquerade that's been using fear to take over a presence in your life. And right now you're ready to take off the masquerade. You're ready to face the thing that you've been so afraid of. And you may find that in the light of day or in the light of Saturn traveling through a fire sign, that it's not as big a deal as you made it. And what you may find is that it's not as larger than life as it used to be, and that is actually infinitely manageable. If you enjoyed what you saw, please press the like button. It helps more than you know. If you could subscribe, that would be wonderful. I've had such a wonderful time visiting with you this week, and I can't wait to get together next time on Christopher Renstrom Astrology.